Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Good morning. I know that you still want to connect, to discuss, but time is our valuable asset today, as yesterday. So, professors, ministers, directors, professors, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the second day of the 14th edition of les Tables Rondes de l'Arbois et de la Méditerranée. This is correct, Professor, now? I hope you had a refreshing evening and you are ready for another day of insightful discussions. I'm pleased to be your host again for the second day to explore and to dig more on our topic on soil, a hope for the world. Yesterday, we set a high bar with engaging talks on hydroclimatic changes, sustainable energy, soil footprint, and much more. And we closed the day with a dynamic roundtable where we discussed research and innovation in relation with the economic development of Africa with the goal SDGs by 2030. And we discussed and we highlight the importance of sharing knowledge to succeed in the SDGs by 2030. Today, we will build on these discussions and dig deeper into specific strategies that addresses sustainable land use, carbon sequestration, and the crucial interaction between human health and the environment. Kicking off today's agenda, we have Professor Johan Buma, who will enlighten us with his presentation on establishing SDG-inspired lighthouses to address future sustainable land use challenges. This session will promise us with a valuable perspective on aligning our land use practices with sustainable development goals. Please help me to welcome Professor Johan Buma. And I want to remind you that he is Professor Emeritus at Wageningen University, Professor of Soil Science. You have, as a reminder, you have 30-minute presentation followed by 10-minute questions from the attendees.
Thank you very much. And first of all, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to express my gratitude for being invited here to speak at this very important and very timely meeting here today. And the title is on the board here. All right, now, I think that we agree that any discussion, whatever it is, benefits from starting with a statement that all can agree with, and certainly at 9:30 in the morning, right? For us, it can be sustainable development with its economic, social, and environmental dimensions. But then, how to define it, and even more important, how to implement it. That's where the problem starts. We all know that the United Nations have defined 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, that have been approved by 193 governments in 2015. Practically everybody. Governments representing practically everybody of us, I should say. These include targets and indicators to be met before the sustainability label can be attached. So far about the good news. A recent progress report I cited here on internet showed that of 140 targets, only 12% are on track. 48% are moderately or severely off track, and 30% show no progress towards the goals aimed at the year 2030. That's not only bad news, that's alarmingly bad news. Now, before submerging ourselves in detailed economic, social, and environmental issues, let's ask ourselves what went wrong. First of all, I feel that the policy community has failed to follow up their signatures in 2015 with a clear and convincing communication effort. This has lacked completely. Nobody in the real world has any idea what SDGs are all about. I think that's a very serious omission. We see that more often in politics, with a lot of hoopla, things are signed and then it's business as usual. But also, the research community, including soil science, have not filled the gap. Only recently are SDGs mentioned in the soil literature. Now, the UN report suggests improvement measures. And the report addresses top-down heads of state, governments, the international community, and member states that should be more active. That's the recommendation. Also, in discussing the role of research aimed at improving implementation of the SDGs, Malekpour et al. Recently emphasized in Nature, top journal, the role of, quote, scientists, institutions, and funders, unquote. They don't mention the stakeholders either, and I refer you to that particular publication. Now, we feel that top-down approaches cannot work when there is no true engagement by stakeholders. When dealing with agriculture, this is not only concerns farmers, but also the consumers of agricultural products, and in fact the entire production chain from, quote, farm to fork, as the European Union has framed it. And let's realize that the top-down approach has had serious effects. Farmers don't trust government. In my country, recent reviews show that 80% of the farmers don't trust government. They question environmental rules and regulations prepared in their perception, I repeat, by their perception, by bureaucrats that don't understand farming. And above all, what they want is clear-cut clarity for an extended period of time. They're sometimes asked to make investments, but they have been written off in, let's say, 20 years or so, and every 4 years things seem to change, and that makes it a hopeless situation. That clarity has not been provided, so there are violent farmer protests occurring all over Europe. And populist parties advance in elections. In my country, the Netherlands, the biggest party has in their program the statement that the climate plans are an elite fabrication and they should go to the shredder. That's the way it is, folks. Now, this is a picture from the Netherlands where farmers were blocking the roads to the government center in The Hague. Could show many more pictures. There are pictures from Germany, from France, from Romania, from all over Europe. Now, why mention all these problems in a meeting that focuses on Africa? Rather than follow the traditional procedure of, quote, showing you the way, unquote, by highlighting our activities in the so-called developed world, in terms of models, methods, and protocols, let's for a change acknowledge the fact that much can be learned about our failures and our attempts to overcome those failures. And I want to emphasize that second aspect, because I want to give a positive talk and not a negative one. And that's what I will try to focus on next. Now, the European Commission, and they introduced the Green Deal in 2019, following the principles of the Sustainable Development Goals, acknowledges the fact that farmers should be more engaged in environmental research, and they advocate in their, quote, soil deal for Europe, and they allocate 1 billion euros until 2028. It's a major program. Emphasis on establishing 100 so-called living labs and lighthouses. And living labs are defined as spaces for co-innovation through participatory, transdisciplinary, systemic research that contribute to Green Deal targets for sustainable farming, climate resilience, biodiversity, and zero pollution. And lighthouses are defined as single sites, like a farm or a park, where to showcase good practices. These are places for demonstration and peer-to-peer learning. And I emphasize here the peer-to-peer learning, which is very important. Now, there are three, in my view, general aspects of farming that should be noticed when working with farmers, and they seem to apply everywhere. I'm really trying not to talk about Europe and my country, but to try to about general principles as far as possible. So first of all, farming is fundamentally different. We all know this, but not many people do. It's fundamentally different from industrial processes, if only because farmers have to deal with unpredictable, varying weather conditions requiring adaptive management. And two, farmers have an independent character. That's their strength. They are in charge and don't like to be told what to do. That's why peer-to-peer learning in lighthouses is so important to be realized in the context of communities of practice. That's another term that is defined as, quote, a group of people who share a concern or passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. And we did some work, it's not a new concept, we did some work on that, we published in Advances in Agronomy a few years ago. Now, there are quite a few current active communities of practice. Organic farms, banning chemical fertilizers and biocides, nature-inclusive farms, example, agroforestry, regenerative farms, no plowing, cover crops, combining arable and dairy farming, precision farming, applying information technology, etc., etc., there are more. Now, I'm not negative on that. I'm highly positive about situations where people are engaged and are enthusiastic about what they're doing. That's fantastic. That's what we need. But all of these are promoted with high energy, I would call messianic fever. They're almost like religions, you know, and that takes a lot of energy. And we can ask the question, are they sustainable, those systems? And we really don't know. And that's why we would recommend communities of practice based on meeting thresholds of ecosystem service indicators, lighthouses allowing peer-to-peer learning in a given region with particular soils as the common focus. If a farmer has a lighthouse, it's not the idea that he sits back and enjoys his privileges. He has to work together with others, developing new approaches as time progresses. It's not a static situation, it's a dynamic situation. And living labs in the same area can learn from the experiences that are achieved in those lighthouses. And the third general point I'd like to mention is there never is one single, quote, magic solution for a given farming system. We have the expression that different roads lead to Rome, right? Following the farming style of a farmer owner of a living lab as much as possible is advisable when exploring the most suitable management measures. But meeting the thresholds of ecosystem services is the overall goal. That's the idea of the community of practice. And this will at least provide the much desired clarity for the farmers and also has a structural link with the policy arena because it is linked to the SDGs. Now, I certainly agree with Malikpour and others that the research community has the capacity and responsibility to close the gap between policy and society. I think they're basically the only group that can do so. But this requires some modifications in our focus and approaches. Now, don't get me wrong, there are certainly examples in many countries of very successful cooperation between farmers and the research community. Many examples, okay? But a broad SDG-inspired form of cooperation is lacking so far, in my view, and this is crucial to link the policy and farmer arenas in future. Now, more specifically, how about the SDGs? You've seen this before. These are the 17 SDGs with some catchy terms to characterize them. I'm not going through that, yeah. Now, when looking at our environmental aspects of sustainable development and agriculture, and we talk for the moment not about the social and economic aspects, at least the following SDGs are important. Good yields of healthy crops, number 2 and 3, preservation of water quality, number 6, saving energy, number 7, mitigating climate change, number 13, and preserving biodiversity and soil health, number 15. That's our listing in our conditions. Now, you may find in your environment that others are more important, but we felt that the 17 goals are overwhelming and maybe paralyzing. It's too much. So you can apply the proportionality principle and saying which ones seem to be most important, and this is what we have done here. Now, how do we judge those SDGs? They're judged by considering indicators and thresholds for ecosystem services. It's another term. These are services provided by the ecosystem to mankind. That's the overall thrust. We have an ecosystem that provides services to mankind, okay? Man as part of a living earth. That's a good concept. It's 20 years old, but it still applies very much. And ecosystem services belong to each SDG, okay? And they have indicators and they have thresholds, separating the good from the not yet good enough. And I avoid saying the good from the bad. No, the bad, that's very negative. The bad, not yet good enough. We're on the way to improvement, right? Now, discussing specific indicators and thresholds is an excellent procedure to create interdisciplinarity, which is difficult to achieve otherwise. Of course, the living labs takes care of the transdisciplinarity. This was discussed yesterday. People said that it's very difficult to have interdisciplinarity, to talk to other professions. They're all in these pillars, and it's very difficult. Well, this way you specify it. When you talk to an agronomist, you ask him, what is a good yield? Considering these soils, these areas, these crops. You can talk to an hydrologist about the water. You can talk to an ecologist about the ecology, to a climatologist about the climate. And I think soil scientists are in a rather unique position to fulfill that central role, to communicate to all those different disciplines, because soil is the most stable element of this whole picture. So that offers a way out of this serious problem of interdisciplinarity and also transdisciplinarity by having the living labs. Now, and last, but certainly not least, SDG-1 covers a good income. There's no sustainable farming systems when farmers cannot make a decent living, of course. We should not forget that. Now, to make it a bit more specific, we established a living lab. And I discussed that here as an example of what we learned, focusing on general aspects that are valid everywhere, I think. And details are in a publication. And the farmer and his son were co-authors of the paper. Of course, I mean, they have vital information. We had some discussions with the editor who felt that, the farmers really had to go into the acknowledgements, right? No way, I mean, they had really serious contributions, so they were co-authors of the paper. All right, here's our living lab. It's a farm in one of our polders. It's a big farm, it's a very successful farm, I should say, and that's what we followed up. Now, it's a bit difficult, maybe this diagram, but this is from the paper where on the left side, you see again these SDGs that we consider, the 6 that I mentioned before. You see that they all have indicators. They're explained in the paper, but there's no time for this now. And yet we have thresholds that are area specific for that soil, for that region, given climate. You can meet them. When you do, it's a lighthouse. If you don't, you have to go back, okay? You have a lighthouse if they are successful for all of them. If not, you have to go back, and then it's interesting to note where the possible problems are. This is focused on ecosystem services, and you see SDG 15 is called Life on Land. It has to do with biodiversity, and it has to do with soil health. But we emphasize the importance by soil health in the right diagram, where again we have indicators. We have physical indicators, or chemical indicators, or biological indicators with carbon in the central position, because carbon is very important for all of them. Again, indicators mentioned in the paper, and thresholds that are site-specific for that particular type of soil in that particular region. So these are the flow diagrams, and it's important to note here that soil is part of number 15, but is also important for all the other ones, like I mentioned before, and I think soil should really rise to the occasion to make that more clear. Now, how to approach living lab research? That's quite a statement, but I give a try in a few points. It seems that some general considerations apply everywhere. And the research community would, in our view, be well advised to first of all focus first on what seem to be successful farms. Creating success stories is the best starting point. Don't start with problems, start with, and they are there. There are lots of farmers who didn't know that something could not be done, and they just did it, okay? Find those people, right? They're all over. And so this is what we did. We found a very successful farm on the best soils of the country and all that to show that they met the deadline. And there's one important aspect of that, and that is communication to society. I don't know about your countries, but in my country, the press and the media are often very negative on agriculture. We have problems with nature, it's agriculture. We have problems with water, it's agriculture. My goodness, there are very many examples of where agriculture takes care of the problem in a very good way. So we are used to being reactive, being mad about things and all that. Let's be proactive and show lighthouses that do a good job, okay? 2, guide and simplify the transdisciplinary discourse by focusing attention to key services. That's what I said. There are 17, we reduced it to 7. But there may be a different choice that you may have. Define relatively simple, transparent, and cheap methods for indicators and their thresholds for ecosystem services. There are schemes where you have 30 indicators. Well, sorry, that's not going to work, okay? So we have about 6, and we develop methods that are relatively cheap and rapid. And that's possible. We have a lot of knowledge on that point, and we should focus on that. 3, define relatively simple, transparent, and cheap methods for indicators and their threshold for ecosystem services. That's what I mentioned. Follow bottom-up. That's the key phrase here. Bottom-up, the farming style of the Living Lab farmer when together defining sustainable management options. Don't come in as a researcher and tell the farmer what you do is wrong, you should do it differently. No, listen to the guy. Listen first before you talk, and then fit in. That's the best way to work. And 5, realize that soil science is not the only game in town, nor are other scientific disciplines. That's true for water, for hydrologists, for agronomists, climatologists, ecologists, you name them. I was a member of the Soil Health and Food Committee of the European Union that made a draft of the soil program for the European Union a few years ago, and I'm happy that we adopted the soil health definition as the continued capacity of soils to support ecosystem services. And that's, to me, a very important definition. It's not soil by itself, it is soil in supporting something else. And for heaven's sake, let's stop discussing now about definitions and all that. There's a recent paper now coming out discussing the definition of soil, for heaven's sake. Let's not do that, let's go to work, right? Let's start with the real action. Oops. Now, before continuing, I think we need to pay attention to different forms of knowledge. And we introduced this diagram a few years ago, where on the horizontal axis you have qualitative ranging to quantitative, and the vertical axis is empirical, so that's experience, tacit knowledge, all the way down to mechanistic, where you understand all the mechanisms. And practitioners often have tacit knowledge, K1 and K2. And scientists tend to focus on publishing specialized K4 and K5 articles, if only to protect their career. That's the way it is. You have to publish or you perish, right? That's a thing we have to do something about in our profession, but that's another discussion. Now, two-way communication is needed to realize effective interaction in a living lab. So that you do things that is based on what farmers are saying and the other way around. And the key point here is that when we look at indicators, it isn't necessarily that they need K5 methods. You can sometimes do it with K3 methods that are just as well. And I guess we have to keep that, in mind. Now, we see a key challenge for the research community. All indicators for the different ecosystem services have to be met at the same time. And research also in soil science tends to focus on certain ecosystem services. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with basic research. We need that to advance our science, and that's very good. But many papers, it's only about production of crops. It's only about pollution of soil and water. It's only about water supply, carbon dynamics, biodiversity. And these studies are often at K5 or K4 level to facilitate publication and literature. But to be sustainable, you have to cover them all. And at this point in time, talking time is over. Talking time is over. There is no time to lose. So sometimes the K3 or even K2 level may work as well. I like to say the better is all too often the enemy of the good. So let's take that to heart. Now, how did this all work in our Living Lab study? And details are in the paper, with a focus on what I think are items that have perhaps a general relevance. At the first point, to start, we selected a well-run, prosperous arable farm on prime agricultural land. They were sustainable. It was clear, and again, I emphasized earlier the very favorable communication aspect of that. But there will be other farms on the same area and the same type of soil where this is not the case. So they can get together and get peer-to-peer learning, which is essential The peer-to-peer learning is essential. You read that also in sociology papers. When a scientist tells them what to do, that's going to work. There's peer-to-peer learning, often over a drink in a bar, and first he will say that's all nonsense, and a few times later they do it, right? That's the way it works. Number two, by considering literature and many measurements in the field, we concluded that income was good, yields were high, there was no soil pollution, we measured heavy metals and pesticides, can be done with modern methods, very fast. There was good water quality, low energy use, optimal carbon capture. Problems were identified, and that's why I mentioned this, that problems come up if you do that. Problems were identified for biodiversity on farm level, lacking ecological criteria. Our problem is a bit, I think, that ecologists look at nature pictures of the past as an ideal picture, and then they look at the current situation and say it doesn't agree, so it's wrong. Well, there is climate change. And what we should say in Holland, for example, is look at the center of France, because that's our future in 2050, as the projections of the IPCC go, right? So we have to take a much more dynamic look at the ecology picture than we do so far. And characterizing soil structure of the problems. It's one of the important indicators for soil health. I'll say more about it in a moment. So we found that in certain areas we needed to look more carefully, need more research. The number three, standard methods were used next to innovative proximal sensing methods. There are very exciting new measurement methods. We worked with Eurofins who's doing that, but I learned that here with you, you're also doing that kind of thing. There are new methods that are quick, relatively cheap and rapid, which is what we need. And that significantly improved the overall testing program. Number four, well, in this case, it turned out that all indicators were met. This was a lighthouse. Now, for that particular farm, there was no need to explore alternative management measures to meet indicator thresholds. But it doesn't mean that the farmer has to sit back, relax, and enjoy his glory. No. The conditions change, so it's not a static, it's a dynamic system, and it's input for the community of practice as developments continue. It's input for other farms in the same area, in the same kind of soils, to find their way to the sustainability statement. Number five, emphasis was on showing the effect of healthy soils on some ecosystem services. High production levels of healthy food, the latter because of demonstrated lack of soil pollution and favorable water and nutrient regimes, all three directly affected by soil properties. The relatively high organic matter content served as a contribution to climate mitigation and probably to an as yet undefined biodiversity. This, I feel very strongly, is the best way to promote soil science, by showing us very clear examples. And then we quote again the definition, the continued capacity of soils to support ecosystem services. Healthy soils provide the highest contributions. That's a fantastic perspective for soil science, right? And let's stop with these talks, these pontifications about the importance of soils without specific examples. That doesn't impress people. Come with specific examples. We can do it. We have it in our hands, and I would really encourage the next generation to focus on this and come with those examples and show really that soils matter and soils play a very important role here. Now, one important lesson. Don't just go by data from databases and models being fed with such data through widely available Peter transfer functions that relate simple soil characteristics, texture, bulk density, carbon percentage, you find that in all databases, to physical characteristics needed for modeling, hydraulic conductivity, moisture retention. I'm a bit ambivalent about this because we introduced this concept of Peter transfer functions in the 1980s, and I'm all in favor of it. But don't use it automatically, okay? Check your soil and see if it fits. Go out in the field and observe before measuring. Because what did we find in this soil? We found that bulk densities and penetration resistance that are often used to characterize soil structure were highly variable because there were very dense clods and it was very loose soil. And it was such a high standard deviation, if you measure that with small cores, that it was not diagnostic at all. So what to do? Well, we have a problem here. Yeah. To judge soil structure, we therefore observe rooting patterns, because roots are the connection between the plant and the soil. What the roots do is very important to show the properties of the soil, right? The structure. Many roots in loose surface soil we found, no roots in compacted fragments, few roots along vertical cracks in compacted soil, somewhat compacted soil from 20 to 40 centimeters, and abundant roots below that level to 80 centimeter depth. Now that's knowledge at K2 level, very important, okay? So we say let the roots do the talking about soil structure, okay? Don't automatically take some data from database, look at your soil. And these observations don't allow application of models, by the way, simulation models for plant growth that assume a homogeneous root zone with a given depth, okay? Such models, and I'm also very much in favor of using models, don't get me wrong, but such models also define soil moisture regimes and implicitly assume soils to be homogeneous and isotopic, which they are not. I was invited to give a webinar for the American Society of Agronomy on March 14, on this particular aspect of soil heterogeneity, and I quote here the YouTube connection. You can look at that. So we used here the old static concept of available water, K3 level, that is better than well-drained soil survey. And what we did not do is say we need another PhD student to look at this, taking another 4 years. Time is up. Talking time is over, okay? That's my main point. Now again, models can and should be used. The reality is overly complex. So models simplify a very complex reality to something you can handle. And that's extremely essential. But with proper input data and boundary conditions built based on field work. Now, assuming that meaningful regional thresholds for ecosystem services have been developed by the research community, and there's still a job to do there, how should sampling and assessment be realized in practice? Now, currently, soil fertility sampling, followed by recommendations for fertilization by specialized commercial agency, and in our case, Eurofence in Holland plays that role, but I'm sure in other countries there are agencies that do the same. It's common practice in many countries. In the Netherlands, 85% of farmers subscribe to the system. Soil is analyzed, recommendations for fertilization are made. That's considered normal. It would seem to be logical to also in future include indicators for ecosystem services, as discussed, to the set. Then not only soil fertility is assessed, but also sustainability of the particular enterprise. Now finally, how about the policymakers and their rules and regulations? I feel that the focus on reaching thresholds of ecosystem services could be central to environmental regulations. And I'm against imposition of particular management systems. We've had the story of a farmer that he got a visit from an expert who told him, you should grow beans because that is necessary. We want to change the meat diet to a vegetarian diet. And he told him, yeah, but I can't sell my beans because there is no market price and can't do that. These kind of things that create a lot of negative reactions. And I think policymakers should not try to sit on the farmer's chair, but they have a very important function in making sure that those indicators, the thresholds of indicators are being met. Very specific, very clear. And subsidies and payments to farmers should not be seen as charity, as some people seem to think, but as an acknowledgement for contributions to society by farmers for having achieved ecosystem services that benefit all of us, okay? The European Union pays 300 billion euros over a period of 7 years to the farmer support. I think it should be guided this way. And only lighthouse farmers and living lab farmers that seriously try to reach the various thresholds should receive such payment. Those that don't care should receive nothing, as far as I'm concerned. They're very loud and very vocal. I'm convinced that the silent majority of farmers is quite willing to follow this pathway if they are provided clarity by the scientific community. And we should have no hectare payments, which we had in the past. I know that is modified already. No. Now, some conclusions that I hope should apply everywhere. First of all, initiate bottom-up living lab studies in a given region, thereby engaging farmers to promote sustainable development in agriculture through communities of practice inspired by lighthouses. This is also good for the agricultural image, as I mentioned earlier. Number two, use a low number of relatively simple and cheap methods to assess ecosystem services and focus research on defining realistic threshold values. The latter is crucial and still requires substantial research. 3, define the ecosystem services that are most relevant for any given living lab, allowing a focus on the most relevant research. And I give that example for soil structure as an example. Always include critical field observations to avoid automatic application of routine database-fed procedures. Artificial intelligence is going to be very important in future, and I'm all in favor, but include reality checks. Just like when using models, include validation in the field, okay? That is sometimes forgotten, and we cannot afford to do that. Number 5, convince the policy arena to focus on reaching thresholds of ecosystem services rather than on imposing particular management methods. And 6, explore the feasibility to extend the mission of commercial soil fertility assessment agencies by including evaluation of ecosystem services, allowing a sustainability judgment. People of the world yearn for sustainable development. Healthy soils can make a major contribution to ecosystem services and provide a challenging focus for the soil science profession from now on. If you succeed here in this university and in Africa to really let this program come to life of living labs and lighthouses, you will be leading in the world. Because in the so-called developed world, we carry a lot of luggage from the past, which is inhibiting our creative activities, in my view. So I wish the young generation lots of luck with that. Grab the ball and run with it, I would say. And indeed, healthy soils, a hope for the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I would take with me some take-home messages. And empathy and active listening are keys for implementing any innovative ideas at scale. So it's time for questions. We have 10 minutes.
Oh boy.
Yes, Leo and Professor Hijri.
Hello. Thank you very much, Professor Buma, for the great presentation, for bringing again the soil health, the measurements, the importance of it for these ecosystem services that we are all looking for. So I think again your presentation was very interesting in the sense of bringing this practicality, how to make it happen, the importance of having the living labs and the lighthouses, and then as something that you have been advocating for a long time now. But when we see that, so you took that farm, so you chose it. It was a good farm, you said it. Again, it was a holistic view that you already had. And then you started to measure it, right? Maybe 2 questions on that. So now we have the soil health law in Europe. And then you're talking a lot about K2 level measurements that you had. How can we then tell that this farm is a good one comparing to the new law? This is one of the questions. So is it the new law really helping to provide, again, to be a support for these lighthouses? And then now, if we have a good farm, so you could see, you chose it. If we have a bad one, we can choose as well. What in the between? So how do we do? Then this lighthouse is a benchmark for the others. How would you proceed now to bring the others to the lighthouse as well? Thank you very much again.
Yeah, no, very, very relevant questions. Well, the K2, K3 was kind of an emergency access. Let's be realistic. I think what you really want to have are measurements for those indicators that are quantitative and reproducible. And then you need methods to do it. We've done it for all the other ones. For carbon, there are a lot of specific measurements being made in the paper. But we found, and that's why I emphasized it, that for getting the moisture regime and with the modeling, that some of the basic assumptions of the model were not met. And I see sometimes applications of the models for situations where they should not be applied because that routing pattern was not in agreement with what was done there. So then, because we wanted to proceed, we took, in this case, basically the K3 level of available water, so that it was there. We could use that in the paper. which was better than still quantitative though, than the K2 level, which is just descriptive, saying a good reason. So I guess I'm saying that if you have the K3 level, it is still quantitative enough to fit the law, I guess, in terms of meeting these indicators. But we should strive, but we should also inspire research to identify with this field analysis the weak spots, where we say, well, we don't know enough about that. That's why I mentioned biodiversity. There are some basic questions there. In terms of characterizing soil structure, there are some basic questions there. So that's where research should go, rather than applied all over the place, which happens a little bit right now, I think. So that's the way. But whatever we do should be in line with the legislation. I think you have a good point there, and I'm fully aware of that, and the K4, K5 approach is good for that, sometimes the K3. Now, in terms of the communication, that is a very key point. There's not really much experience with that, but the idea is that you regionalize the thing in terms of talking about different soil types, because different soil types, every soil has a story to tell, I always say. If you have a clay soil or a sand or a peat, it's quite different in terms of the thresholds for the indicators, okay? So you have a farm that qualifies, like the one we have, so then that's a heavy clay soil in one of our polders. It's 60,000 hectares in the Netherlands with that soil type, okay? You need living labs that may not meet it, and then the idea is that not to say, well, you should do the same as the farmer who has a lighthouse. No. You may have different ways in your farming style and so on, and the researchers should talk with that guy to see how he could also achieve that good level. A different road that leads to Rome. There should be room for that, because farmers, we find, are very sensitive to being told you do it wrong and you should do it differently. That doesn't work. And then the peer-to-peer learning that is fortunately emphasized in those lighthouses is very important, because that's how it works with farmers. They see each other, they talk. So there are discussion groups. There are discussion groups right now that are getting lost, that are people, abort them, don't go to them anymore, because it's all babbling, they don't know what the hell it's all about, right? So if you say, no, it's about these indicators, it's about these thresholds, you'll have a specific goal. That is, I think, very important, not only for interdisciplinarity, as I mentioned, but also for this interaction process. The farmers should talk together. There are these groups already, discussion groups, and the scientists should join them, not by telling them what to do, but by listening and trying to communicate, because science is the glue there to put things together. We have a tremendous important task as a scientist here. And I don't know any other group that can do that. So I find it very, I'm an old guy by now, but I find it still very exciting that this is the case. So that works. We've seen examples of that it works. And it is a very powerful way of being contra the negativism that you find all over the place. Agriculture is very reactive to things. This is proactive. We can show and tell and communicate it in a way that the public at large also shows that agriculture provides a very positive contribution to sustainable development. We have a big job to do there, and I hope you people here and in Africa will really carry the ball on that point and show us. We need examples. I'm very pessimistic about what happens in my country in terms of achieving this, quite frankly. Don't quote me here, but I guess that's the way it is. So please take the ball and run with it.
Thank you, Professor. We have another question from Professor Hijri and Professor Alain.
Thank you. You have mentioned the role of the roots on soil structure. As a microbiologist and mycologist, there is a piece missing there in that equation, which are microbes that are really crucial for soil structure, particularly for sandy soils. I want to have your comment on that. Yeah. The role of microbes in soil structure, but also as a predictor for soil health and ecosystem services.
Yeah. I fully agree, and I'm glad you raised that issue. Let's realize soil is a living entity. Soil is alive. And we have a history in soil science where soil physics and soil chemistry have rather dominated, and that, well, it's a fact of life, where it was a bit forgotten that soil is alive. that the bacteria and the macro animals, the worms and all that, are extremely important for the dynamic living character of the soil, and that's very much part of it. But my point here was particularly that if you say what is the crop getting from the soil? Well, it's through the roots. That's the medium you get it. Eh? And if you have a highly biological soil, you have nice little aggregates where every part of the soil is in diffusion distance from the roots, and that's of course perfect. And the reason why you have a good structure is then soil biology. Sure, absolutely. But it's the next step to say, now it is good. Why is it good? And what kind of management does belong to that? What has that farmer done in order to achieve that kind of structure? I guess that's the sequence we have here. But no question about the fact that soil is life, and we should cherish that and we should protect that, certainly. Yes.
We have a question here. Yes.
Thank you. Very naive question, because I'm not by all means an expert of the field, but I'm following what's going on. You mentioned the protest in the Netherlands, and we have a lot of protests in France about the decision of the European Commission and about the problems in agriculture. So the voter does not know what to do and doesn't understand. You mentioned communication as a key issue, and the role of scientists. Who is right and who is wrong in this debate? Is a commission a lot of bureaucrats? Or is that true? Is it not true? And it's totally confusing for even nobody knows what to do. And politicians, they are very strong in making arguments for all kinds. And it's very, very tough for people who just have to vote and decide.
Oh, yeah.
So can you elaborate? And we don't hear the scientists so much.
It's a highly relevant comment. And when I say that the bureaucrats do this, that, and the other thing, I quote the protesting farmers. And I've been a member of the European Committee, the Fairman Committee that studied soil health and food over a 3-year period. It ended in 2022, and well, we have now the soil program for Europe with a lot of funds, and I've seen some of the Brussels structure, and I'm thoroughly convinced that there are quite knowledgeable people that try to, with the best of intentions, try to achieve sustainability and an agriculture that contributes to that sustainability. But there is a communication link, I think, between what they do with the best of intention and with a lot of knowledge. I don't go for statements that those bureaucrats don't know anything, or that's nonsense. There are very many dedicated people there. But there is a communication gap with practice that is clear, and so we're not telling the right story, and it's all reactive, what happens, and it's talking about an elite that has all kind of funny ideas. People are very unsure there. So I think a proactive approach by showing that it works, and the earlier question about the soil law that is there, and is important because it's a reflection of policy, and we can show our examples that it fits in, so that the policy thing with the reality in the field fits in. But we need desperately those examples. Those examples are not there. It's very fragmented research, I'm sorry to say, and well, we have to do a better job. So it's up to the future generation to pick that up and show that. So I think that's the recipe for progress, but it will take a while and take a long time, and there's going to be a certain group of people that will, whatever you do, will ignore it and will complain about the elite that does funny things, but that's a relatively small group. That's my hope. It's maybe 10% or 15%. The large majority of citizens and farmers want to be fed with relevant information they can believe in. They're sensible people, and I think we should address them better by taking this proactive approach. But your point is quite correct. We have a big problem right now. There's no question about it. And if you here at the university and in Africa can overcome this barrier, perhaps the way I talked about, maybe other ways, I don't care, please do, because we desperately need it.
Thank you. We have one last question, because, sorry, I just want to mention that our next speaker will be on Teams. So just be quick. I know that the inner soil is like, you will, I'm sure you will talk, your comment yesterday was very nice.
Yeah,
about
I want to make a different comment.
Yes,
so
please.
I just wanted to ask you about the definition. You emphasize a lot about it's time to not basically do action and not talk that much, but all I hear is actually talking. My question is, you define soil as the definition that you provided is that its capacity to provide, to be sustainable for the ecosystem services, but meanwhile you're talking about this K1, K2, up to K4 knowledge. Don't you think that this definition is actually very utilitarian, because you're just focusing on ecosystem services, but soil is actually more than that? And I think when we think about artificial intelligence, I think, again, you get back to the same problem of sustainability, that it was defined as its ability to generate for future generation, and the economic part and capitalistic basically gains took over the part of society and environment. So I think a little bit this definition that you're providing, I mean, based on experience of sustainable development, I think it's utilitarian. So I wanted to know what you think about this comment or question. Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I get the key of your question, but the key point of mine was to say the soil contribution to ecosystem services, like we have hydrology contributions, we have ecology contributions, climatology contributions. That means you're aware of the bigger picture. Now, of course, that's particularly environment. And I think I would agree with you that sustainability is more than the environment. It's also the social element. And I think the Living Lab is providing an entry point there that is relevant, but it's only a start. You have to also communicate with the larger population. Well, I addressed it as well. And there is the economic aspect, where we had a very interesting lecture yesterday saying that our gross national product is still defined in economic terms, and we have to get away from that and also have the environmental and social aspects reflected in it. And I think that's a key issue, and that's very important. And the elements that I have tried to present fit in there in a small way, because the world is a hell of a lot bigger than just our agriculture problems, let's face it. But we have to start somewhere. And the big challenge we have is being overwhelmed by this complexity and being baffled and not do anything. And we cannot afford to do that. So each of one in our own bubble, if you like, should try to find ways to do something. And that was the main spirit of what I've been trying to talk about.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, dear attendees. Now we will move to the next talk. It will be presented by Professor Ratan Lal via Teams. And he will be talking about carbon sequestration in soils as climate warming mitigation, a critical topic as we seek solutions to one of our most pressing global challenges. So I think you will be sharing the screen in a few minutes. Yeah. Welcome, Professor. I think
Thank you.
Shared. Yeah. So you have 30 minutes presentation, and I will be, I don't know if you can see the room, but I will be moving toward the stage so you can understand that your 30 minutes is over. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll talk about carbon sequestration in the context of food security in Africa. Africa has the natural resources needed to create something similar to the Cerrado miracle in Brazil. And Africa should be indeed, on the basis of the natural resources, the next breadbasket of the world. The strategy to translate the proven agronomic soil management science into action through policy which must be pro-nature, pro-agriculture, and pro-farmer. The traditional system that is widely practiced has a slow increase in productivity. What we are hoping is at a much higher level, and to change from
is critical. Global fertilizer use average is 146 kilogram per hectare. Africa has 22 kilogram per hectare. Sub-Saharan Africa has 20% of the world's arable land, but it consumes only 2% of the world fertilizer. Therefore, this needs to be addressed along with irrigation. Irrigation can alleviate drought and can double or more production comparable to rainfed crop yields. However, only 6 to 7% of cropland in Africa, about 13 million hectares, is presently irrigated, compared with 14% in Latin America and almost 40% in South Asia and China. Drip sub-fertigation that saves water, energy, fertilizer would be promoted under the hopefully soon to be implemented MASHA project. Now, managing soil health in Africa, the MASHA, it's designed, aimed at restoring soil health of arable, grazing and forest lands, reclaiming 25% of land in Africa, which is already severely to moderately degraded, improving well-being of almost 180 million people who are living on the land that is in some way degraded, and reducing risks of soil erosion and degradation in Africa due to climate change. At the same time, promoting nutrition-sensitive agriculture. The objective is not just to increase production, but the nutrient density, especially of micronutrients and protein, should be also considered as a very, very high priority. In most cases, the optimal organic matter content in soil is about 2.5 to 3.5%. Soil organic carbon content is about half of that. But in many cropland soils of Africa, the soil organic carbon content in the root zone top layer, 30 centimeter, is often less than 0.5. Therefore, even the potential of elite varieties and inputs of fertilizer and water and other energy-based component cannot be realized because soil health is strongly determined by soil organic matter content. One of the possibility is regenerative agriculture. That's a concept. It's an approach. It's a strategy. It's an idea. It includes many practices. It's not just one practice, many. The idea is inspired by eco-innovation, powered by non-carbon energy, driven by a circular economy and green infrastructure, but most importantly, supported by the recarbonization of the terrestrial biosphere, that's soil and vegetation, at the bedrock of sustainable development, putting carbon back in soil, which we have lost because of historic land misuse and soil mismanagement. Through nature-positive agricultural practices, which protect, manage, and restore soil, strengthen biodiversity, improve water quality and renewability, adopt negative emission farming, not zero emission farming, negative. Agriculture is the only industry where emission can be negative, should be negative, have to be negative. Reduce input of chemicals, use biostimulants and organic amendments, promote a biocircular economy, support the One Health concept, health of soil, plants, animal, people, environment, and the planet is one and indivisible. Use digital innovation. Some of the examples of positive agriculture which conserve, improve, restore nature are conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture, agroecology, agroforestry, integration of crops with trees and livestock, practices which create positive soil ecosystem carbon budget, CNPK, C carbon comes before NPK, through integrated soil fertility management, balanced use of plant nutrients, not just in nitrogen, which is often subsidized, but also PK, calcium, magnesium, and micronutrients, drip fertigation, digital agriculture, artificial intelligence, including drones and robotics. The idea is to reduce carbon emission from farm operations, sequester carbon in soil, trees, wetlands, mineland, degraded lands, such as through practices like no-till agriculture. This is a picture of my own experiments in 1971. at IIT in Nigeria. And we also found through long-term experiment that returning the crop residue mulch is critical. Otherwise, no-till will not function. Here is an example of a plot where the residue in the foreground plot was removed for 15 years continuously. The crop residue was left on the land in the plot in the background. So residue, food for microorganisms, because soil biota is the bio-engine of the earth and crop residue is their food. So to think that we can have a free biofuel from crop residue, think again. Soil organism must be fed. Cover cropping, this is a picture of Mucuna utilis. You can produce 20 tons of biomass over a very short period of time, like 3 to 4 months, and fix perhaps 40 to 60 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare, which can be very, very important. As far as the drought is concerned, mulch farming, conservation agriculture, drip sub-irrigation, solar irrigation systems based for drip irrigation, and of course improving soil organic carbon content, which is essential to improve available water capacity, nutrient use efficiency, and of course mitigate and adapt climate change. That brings me to the topic of carbon farming. Growing carbon in soil as a commodity, such as you grow corn, soybean, cassava, yam, sweet potato, and it can bring an income stream. Growing soil carbon as a farm commodity that provides income to the farmer. How much income? Equal to the societal value of carbon. The societal value of carbon, whatever ecosystem services produce, is approximately $150 to $200 per ton of carbon, which translates to somewhere between $40 and $52 per credit, that is 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. Farmers should be paid that amount, and that way we can address many sustainable development goals if farmers are paid properly, accurately, transparently, and justly. Private sector can play a very critical role. It can help promote nature positive agriculture, increase access to input, improve investment in agriculture research, development, and education. So private sector could be very important. We are hoping that under the MASHA that we are discussing at the moment with the UM6P and other colleagues in Africa, especially AAA, we create transects identifying different biomes and ecoregion, biophysical and socioeconomic, and evaluate practices that we just discussed under real-world on-farm conditions. Not on small plots, not on greenhouses, but under real-world conditions. The objective of Living Soil of Africa and the MASHA project that we are hoping will be implemented, assess soil organic carbon stock and flux. Number 2, relate carbon stock and flux to agronomic productivity, evaluate savings in input by improving the soil carbon stock, validate models with real ground truth data under actual farming condition, develop scaling protocols so we can upscale adoption of best management practices, and provide training opportunity and identify policy issues which promote Soil Health Act. We hope that the policymaker will create Soil Health Act at national, regional, and continental level. Action needed between now and 2030 by MASHA and Living Soils of Africa program that we are also in discussion with IICA, Inter-American Institute of Cooperation in Agriculture. They are also interested in the same concept. We must increase fertilizer use and its efficiency, improve soil health and agronomic productivity, increase land area under irrigation, remove CO2 from the atmosphere by sequestering carbon in the terrestrial ecosystem, include soil restoration as an integral component of the national regional program, and protect carbon in soils, forests, and wetlands. A roadmap of MASHA, a suggestion for consideration, such as, an example, fertilizer use. 2020 had 17 kilograms. By 2030, hopefully we can get up to 50, 60 kilograms. Irrigated cropland area, 6% in 2020. Hopefully, we can triple it by 2030. Conservation agriculture, 1.5 million hectare. We can promote as much as 50 million hectare if possible. Agroforestry, only 10% of tree cover to be doubled within the next 6, 7, 8 years. By doing that, with political willpower to translate science into action, by empowering farmers, most of them are women farmers, cultivating 2, 5, 10 acres. Through pro-farming policies, Africa must be, can be, should be the next breadbasket of the world. It has the physical resources to do so. Africa's food import at the moment, some people think is currently almost $60 billion per year, which could reach 90 billion by 2030. If this money should be invested in promoting science-based agriculture, things will be very, very, very different. And that's a policy we must promote. With adoption of improved agriculture, such as that proposed under AAA and LISOF and other program, Africa has the resources to be food self-sufficient for now and the future population. And the goal is, the mission is, no farmer is left behind. And that's the policy, that's the mission, that's the aspiration that we must have. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for saving us a few minutes so we can have more questions. So we have, yes, Leo. The second one. Goni.
Hello, hello, Professor Lal. Leonardo Vergutz here. I don't know if you can see us. Thank you for the thank you for the presentation. So I would just like to go back. You showed a very nice picture when you were again showing the removal of the residues to produce biofuel, and then you actually showed the issue with the poverty not only of sub-Saharan African soils but the tropical soils. So what Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, is facing now, it's the poverty of the soils being translated to the crops and then to the people in this, again, vicious cycle of poverty and land degradation. They keep trying to produce food, they cannot, and they change the land, and then they leave behind a track of degradation. But I remember we were having in another event when we were discussing the potential of these soils to sequester carbon. Currently, because of this, again, the lack of nutrients, the climate, this is the region where we have the lowest amounts of carbon. But because we have all these very deep soils in the tropical area, so physically they are very good. And then we were discussing about this, again, the immense, the huge potential of these soils to act as a carbon sequestration tool. Can you comment a little bit more on this? What would be the size, again, how important it would be these tropical soils to help us decarbonizing, again, our way of living? And thank you very much for the presentation.
Well, that's a very good question. I showed how the crop residue is so critical. We had the improved variety in that foreground plot. We did apply the recommended rate of fertilizer, but soil was practically dead. The previous speaker mentioned the importance that soil is a living entity. It indeed is a living entity, the largest reservoir of terrestrial biodiversity. This living organism in soil require food, and their food is the biomass, just as our food is the biomass. So the crop residue, root biomass, shoot biomass, cover crop residue should be returned back to the land, which desperateness, poverty does not permit to the farmers. And therefore we must make a provision to reward them for carbon sequestration. And as I suggested, $50 per credit. Less than that, things are not very, very good. The other part of carbon sequestration, which is very relevant, especially for the Mediterranean region, the northern part, drier, semi-arid, subhumid and arid climate, is inorganic carbon. And we do not much talk about inorganic carbon sequestration. That is when CO2 evolved from microorganism by transforming, changing biomass through respiration process. When that dissolves in water to create carbonic acid reacts with calcium, magnesium, potassium, especially added from outside the system, and they precipitate. That is formation of carbonates. And that is a very good mechanism of carbon sequestration. In fact, our estimate is that in arid, semi-arid climate, the abiotic process of carbon sequestration that I just described may be sequestering as much as 1 petagram, 1 billion tons of carbon per year on a global scale. And that part can be accelerated, increased, improved if we irrigate with good quality water. Then you are leaching bicarbonates into the subsoil. So promoting better agriculture where crop residues are returned to the land, cover crops are grown, and we make a policy, grains and tuber for people, residues and root biomass for the soil. That equity we must maintain. And restoring carbon soils in Africa is one of the great options we have to make agriculture a solution to climate change and environment, a solution. Obviously, finding alternative to fossil fuel is very important. But then if we find alternative to fossil fuel, better agriculture is the most cost-effective triple win option. And that is what we should focus on.
Thank you so much, Professor Lau, for the presentation, and very inspiring. This is Ngoni from UM6P. I really enjoyed listening to your talk about the Masha program. And I was just wondering, when you showed the slide of the different challenges that we have, for sure, one of the biggest elephants in the room is security of tenure. I mean, and yesterday we were talking about incentives. And if you look at the issue of, for instance, overgrazing, it's really about the tragedy of the commons. I don't know whether in the Masha program you are also going to be looking at, since human beings were driven, like from yesterday's discussion, we are really driven by incentives. And are you going to be also looking at security of tenure specifically? Because we have a buffet of options that we can offer to the farmers to use, but the incentives are just not right. And sometimes farmers don't even own the land where they're working on. So there's no incentive for them to invest in that land. So I don't know if Masha is also going that far as looking at discussions of security of tenure. Thank you.
Yes, land tenure is definitely a very critical component. And when I worked in sub-Saharan Africa for almost 20 years, that issue came up when we suggested afforestation, planting perennial or the trees or shrubs on the contour hedges so that soil erosion can be protected both by water and wind. The reluctance was that the land does not belong to the cultivator. It belongs to somebody else, and therefore they are very reluctant to plant trees themselves, but at the same time, the landowner would not like the cultivator to plant trees. So it is very important that in addition to biophysical part, which people like me focus on, carbon sequestration, erosion control, improving soil structure, water holding capacity, the human dimension issue, land tenure, access to resources by women farmers, which a majority of the farmers in sub-Saharan Africa are women. And therefore the human dimension part, the tenure rights, the access to inputs, the educational component, empowering farmers, empowering women, so they are control of their own destiny. These are very, very, very critical. The biophysical part by itself may not be effective if the human dimensions are not addressed. So you are right, they both need to go hand in hand. And while we have been talking so far, Masha, improving soil health, we certainly will involve social scientists and economists to work with us. We work with them to make sure that the Masha project also consider the human dimension issue. Very important part, as you already mentioned.
Mike. Mike.
Any other question?
Mike's.
Are we still connected?
Yes,
I
yes,
cannot
Professor.
see anybody.
We are waiting for a question
Yes.
from Professor Leisinger.
Good morning, Professor Klaus Leisinger speaking. Thank you very much for a very excellent speech. If you listen to that, and if you consider that what it could be, what it could create for sub-Saharan Africa and beyond, that's certainly worth a Nobel Prize. Because, it has to do not only with soil conservation, it has to do with rural incomes, it has to do with, if it is successful, anti-migration work. It is so much more important, and lifting the quality of life in the rural areas also has a very political, desirable political effect. The question is, who is going to pay for that? The 50 million or the 50 billion that are currently paid for importing food to Africa is partly international money and it is national money, but there is a business model behind, and those people who benefit from this business model will probably not be very keen to support something that puts them out of this business. On the other hand, the European Union and single states like Germany and France are dishing out billions to countries to prevent migration, and if they would invest this money in a Masha program, it would do much more than preventing migration. It would create local perspectives and and increases in the local quality of life. So if you would have to mention a house number, so to say, how much would such a program cost for 3 to 5 years? How high do you judge the chance of money matching local money with international money, be it through the IMF or be it through development cooperation and the Gates Foundation and others? What would be such a figure over 3 to 5 years? What can one do to create not only the political will to get something done, but to put the money where the mouth is, and also not only talk nice, but also pay?
Thank you. Very, very, very important question. And I discussed similar question that you raised at the meeting of COP28 in Dubai that we had last year. So somebody had asked how much money it will cost globally. So my rough estimation was we got 500 million small landholders throughout the world, and to pay them $50 per credit, we probably need somewhere $50 to $60 billion per year just to pay small farmers. Then the medium and large farmers, including in Europe and Australia and US and Canada, they should not be left behind either. If they sequester carbon, we probably need another 50 billion for those farmers. So my guesstimate was, and that's a guesstimate, $100 billion per year just for agriculture, so that agriculture become a solution. Then the question is, where will that money come from? And that is, if I may be bold enough, I'm not going to say anything negative for anybody. We had our host, UAE, that said we will provide $250 million toward agriculture transformation. And of course, as a soil scientist, I am grateful that somebody offered us $250 billion. But that's a drop in the ocean. $250 billion will not do the job. Let's face it. Therefore, while I'm grateful to that gesture provided, but UAE and other oil exporters have to think again. Let's take the case of cancer issue from smoking. Who was the culprit? The company that's selling tobacco. They are now paying for the restoration. Who has created the climate change problem? The fossil fuel combustion. Shouldn't the fossil fuel industry then now realize that they have responsibility, moral duty to pay back to the society? So let us say that they pay out of that $100 billion, maybe 50, 60, 70%. Remaining 30% or 40%, consumer must also take a responsibility. Both parties. The person suffering from cancer has also responsibility to stop smoking and do curative measure and preventive measure. Similarly, the consumer also has a responsibility. So while the fossil fuel company pay maybe more than 50% of that $100 billion per year, you and me, we all of us are victim and culprit at the same time. We also have a responsibility. Change our lifestyle. Be thinking about the natural resources. Change your diet habit. Change your use of resources in a way that they can be saved for future use. Use the earth as something that we can restore. And if we did, each one of us, 8.2 billion of us, if we each saved our carbon footprint by few kilograms of carbon dioxide emission even per year, we can make a difference. So who pays? All of us, including the industry and including the consumer, and with education, with determination, with understanding that this planet Earth we must do something for future generation to come, I'm very positive that not only Africa can become food self-sufficient and food breadbasket, but this world can change the environment for the better. We have the capacity to do it. We just need willpower and determination to take that action.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Lal. This is Ruth Onyango from Kenya. You know, we're assuming that there is will all over to get rid of hunger. I don't think so. This Africa was able to feed itself before, in the 70s, before structural adjustment. This Africa was able to export food. This Africa has not always been hungry. And now, we had an opportunity during Corona. I remember in Kenya, nobody went hungry in Kenya. Just for the first few weeks when we were still relying on imports. But finally, we went into a survival mode. We started to feed ourselves. You know, who benefits from all those imports? You said so yourself. There are people who benefit, including our political leaders. They benefit from those imports. As soon as Corona was out of the way, imports again came back, and right now they are so high we can hardly survive. So where do you see this political will, Prof? You know, where do you really see it? To make sure we get rid of hunger. Yes. Thank you.
You are very right. I think, you know, yesterday we had a meeting with some policymakers from around the world, and this question, who will feed Africa? Let me go back in the early 60s. It was the same question, who will feed India? There was a book by Papadaki's brother, forget about India, it's a basket case. Forget about Bangladesh, you cannot feed them. Let nature take the course. Then came Lester Brown's book, Who Will Feed China? Well, the same question, who will feed Africa? Let me say it very clearly, Africa will feed Africa with its determination to do so, with its political willpower to do so. Political willpower is the fifth capital which is missing. And we need to keep talking about it. And with that, there is no reason why Africa cannot take care of it. It has to, it will. I'm very confident that we'll see that in the near future it will. But it's going to take dialogue, it's going to take discussion, it's going to take honest discussion between the policymaker and the general public. That our future is at stake, our natural resources are at stake. We have to make policies which are pro-nature, not pro-policymakers. That's a key issue. I'm sure it will happen. We have examples of very good leaders, and I think that goodness will prevail. And a meeting such as this will indicate the importance that policymaker can certainly not necessarily take a short-term objectives of immediate quick returns, but a long-term goal of sustainable development. And with that, and with education, and with the education, especially of the women, home garden. I wrote an article during the COVID time when the disruptions in food supply chain happened. Even if you have a very small home garden, 5 meter by 5 meter or 2 meter by 2 meter, and you're growing cucumber and tomatoes and zucchini or beans or okra, it can make a big difference. So as long as we are willing to do things which are appropriate, and as long as we are willing to convince our policymaker that let's be looking after the entire nation and entire continent, I'm confident, I'm very optimistic that things will change very soon. They have to change. Africa cannot continue the way it is. It has some of the world's best resources available, and there is no reason for starvation. Absolutely none.
Thank you. We have one last question.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation and for sharing also your knowledge on this. I had 2 questions, if I may. First, if you could tell us a little bit more about how we find the estimation of the societal value of the carbon credits. You shared the figure around $40 to $50 per ton of CO2. Knowing that today, unfortunately, there is, at least on the voluntary market in Africa, the prices are much lower than that. And then there's the question, how do we fill that gap? And the second question is in relation to the permanence issue in the carbon sequestration estimation in relation to agriculture, and especially in the context of Africa with the issues of land rights. How can we, or any ideas or recommendation on how we can mitigate the permanence issue? Thank you.
Thanks very much. The question of societal value, which I said $150 to $200 per ton, I calculated in the 2010, I published an article based on the Chicago market prices at that time. And I can send that article to Leonardo's or Hind. I think I'll send it to Hind, and she can distribute to all participants. I took the price of everything. I took the price of crop residue or hay, since we are asking farmer to return back. That hay has a very high CN ratio, CP ratio, CS ratio. So you need additional nutrients to convert that hay, biomass, cellulose and lignin into humic substances, which are enriched. So there has to be nutrients available. I calculated the cost of growing cover crops and the time duration that it requires. So this is a different approach than saying market will decide price of the carbon credit. And I don't think the market exists at the moment. It is not functional. Even in the US, it's not functional. Maybe EU with the Green Deal, it's really better off, but not certainly anywhere else. So pay farmer societal value, not the value which is determined by demand and supply. And let me say something about demand and supply. I'm not an economist, and I cannot claim that I know the economics, but we did have a Chicago Climate Exchange in 2000. The cost of one carbon credit is $1. It went up to $6 per credit by 2006 or 7 over that 5-6 year period. And then because there was a lot of supply and no demand, the market collapsed to 20 cents a credit, 20 cents. And you can go and check Chicago Climate Exchange now, it's still less than $1 per credit. Who will do carbon sequestration the way I was deciding, leave the residue, add additional nutrient, grow a cover crop? Who's going to do it for $1 a credit? Forget it. Therefore, until the market develops properly, pay the societal value of carbon. How much ecosystem services are created by restoring soil health, that's the societal value. That's what I was saying, pay $50 per credit. So I do not want to name the organization or anybody, but say, I will pay you $8 or $10. No, undervaluing such a precious resource is a crime. That's the problem, tragedy of the common. You cannot undervalue such a precious resource. You've got to pay farmer properly, fairly, transparently, justly, if you want them to turn the whole system around. As far as permanence is concerned, I have a very strong views about that. This idea of permanence and leakage, it originated from geological sequestration technology. Geological sequestration is where you take CO2 from the chimney of a coal-fired power plant or ethanol plants or something else, and then liquefy it, compress it, and inject it about a mile deep in a subsoil strata, deep in the horizon, below the saline aquifer somewhere or below a stable rock. And then the question arises, is this thing a permanent there or is it going to leak out? So the leakage, permanence, verifiable, all the terminology was associated with geoengineering technology. To use the same technology in agriculture, I think it's a misuse of terminology. Now, if you put carbon back in soil according to what I described, leave the crop residue, don't plow, have cover crop, have perennial hedgerows, and you do not disturb them, where is that carbon going to go? It will keep accumulating it. But if you plow it up because you didn't pay the farmer, of course it will leak out. It will decompose. But if you say that keep the land always covered and do not plow, where is that carbon going to go? So do not misuse terminology from another process. And we have to be very, very careful about it. So if a land is managed properly, you do not plow, you do not disturb, you do not make ridges and mounds, and you return the crop residue and you go cover crop, and farmers are paid properly for doing it, how can it leak out? Where will it leak out? I want to hear somebody who says it will leak out.
Thank you, Professor, for your answers. Now, we will keep discussing soil, but from another perspective. We will discuss it from isotopic perspective. And please help me to welcome Professor Bruno Hamla. He is professor at Aix-Marseille University, and he will talk about isotopic markers to ensure turnover carbon sequestration in soils.
Thank you, dear host, and good morning to everybody. Following the bright discussions and overviews yesterday and this morning about the global challenges of the soil future, I have a somewhat perilous job of bringing you back to the ground level and take a closer look at the raw experimental measurements that we can obtain within the soil itself. We need indeed to see how we can acquire solid quantitative information on which any global strategic discussion has to be firmly grounded. Specifically, I will try to explain how we can use isotopic traces to document the soil organic matter turnover and sequestration. So clearly this is, I'm afraid, K4 or K5 approach, and I hope that Professor Buma will not be too much upset against me. It's certainly not cheap and not a fast approach, but I hope I convince you that it's worth doing it anyway. In fact, when you speak of soil with an isotope geochemist, he will probably immediately unpack a full toolbox of various isotopes or isotopic ratios, each of which can be targeted to a specific window of soil history, from parent rock weathering over geological timescales up to the present day anthropogenic impact of contamination or erosion. However, if you want to focus on organic carbon cycle, which is my topic here today, we are more or less locked down with carbon isotopes, although I will try to show you that in some cases we can also use other isotopes that we call analogs. So my purpose here is review some of the outstanding results already obtained and explain methods, point out limitations and pending questions, and show some recent examples of applications regarding what we call the 4 per mil initiative. Let's begin with C13, the little brother of the carbon family with only 1.1% abundance. This gives me the opportunity to begin by paying homage to our colleague and friend at CEREJ, Jérôme Balédan, whom we missed deeply since already 4 years. He was one of the pioneers in exploiting as a probe the amazing property of photosynthesis that separates the so-called C3 and C4 plants with different isotopic compositions for carbon. Trees being relatively more depleted on the left of the picture in C13 with respect to C12 than grasses. The isotopic ratio is expressed with the conventional notation delta C13, which is a relative unit in per mil variation by reference to a common reference. As a consequence of this difference, in any case where a change of vegetation occurs at a given date, either due to change of crop or to deforestation, the soil organic matter will progressively record the new carbon input by shifting isotopic composition. Here is one example from a recent thesis at CEREJ, on which I may come back later. 2 different types of soil at La Réunion Island, 13 years of survey on top 15 centimeter soil samples. On the left, you see the delta C13 increasing with case because vegetation above the ground has shifted to mil with the delta C13 above the scale of minus 14 per mil. And on the other case on the right, you see a decrease in isotopic composition because the forest is regrowing at that site with C3 isotopic composition downward in that case, minus 28 per mil. We have thus obviously a tracer of the kinetics of replacement of the old carbon by new carbon following a vegetation change. And clearly, at any given time on those sequence, you can calculate the proportion of new carbon versus old carbon in your samples. The measurements are reasonably easy, although typically a K4 and K5 approach again, especially since the development of a recent technique of laser spectroscopy on the right over the last decade, which is substituting progressively the traditional gas mass spectrometric technique. Hundreds of examples of this technique have been measured until now. A landmark contribution of Jérôme Balédan was published 6 years ago with a thorough compilation of the data bank available at that time, where C13 measurements had been carried out on soil profiles, depth profiles, and where the date of vegetation change over the land was known. So again, knowing the isotopic composition of the two end members, you calculate the proportion of new carbon, meaning carbon younger than the date of vegetation change, and you can classify the samples according to this age. So Jérôme Balédan obtained this remarkable image of carbon depth penetration with time. You see on the picture for the sites older than 1,000 years, which are the black squares on the right of the picture. The replacement is essentially complete at the surface, close to 100%, but not quite yet at depth, which gives a first direct evidence of the long-term preservation of slow turnover carbon phases in subsoils horizons. At the opposite, on the other side, only a minor carbon proportion is renewed in the less than 10 years sites. These are the black triangles on the left of the picture, except only in the very shallow depths. The next step clearly was then to do some statistics on those results in order to infer this cornerstone image of carbon age distribution on, in this case, a subset of 55 sites of under tropical climate. So this is to calculate the proportion of a given age at each depth in the profile. So you see that 50% of carbon is less than 10 years at the surface, but more than 1,000 years at 1 meter depth. Those data can also be integrated in order to obtain mean ages weighted by the carbon concentration. So please memorize the mean soil organic carbon age of 489 years integrated over the 1 meter soil section, on which I will come back in a minute. So this invaluable delta C13 database can also be used to start comparing different biomes or different land uses for contrasting carbon turnover efficiency. I don't have time to go much into detail here, but for instance, on this figure, we see that cropland incorporates less new carbon in topsoils than forest and grasslands, obviously due to the above ground biomass removal during harvesting. Let's now shift to C14, the radioactive cosmogenic isotope of 5,700 years half-life period that Edward Bard mentioned yesterday. As he mentioned, the field was completely revolutionized by the introduction of accelerator mass spectrometry about 3 decades ago, which allows some happy few to measure the extremely low isotopic abundance of C14, 10⁻12, compared to C12. Again, this is clearly K5 approach. 3 machines like this are currently operated in France. One, the big one, is the national facility Artemis in Saclay, and 2 recent miniaturized versions of those machines are in operation, one at Serrège and the other at LSC in Saclay also. The rationale with C14 is very different from that of C13, but it's very crude as well, as you will see. The natural atmospheric abundance of C14 is classically used for dating carbon samples over a few tens of thousand years in archaeology or paleoclimate studies, as Edward described yesterday. However, the natural abundance expressed again in relative unit, expressed in per mil relative to, by comparison with a pre-industrial reference, this natural abundance has been completely overwhelmed by the massive release of C14 produced by the tests of atmospheric nuclear weapons between 1954 and 1962, leading to almost a doubling of the atmospheric content over that period, followed by a slow decrease that continues up to now. As a consequence of this bomb, so-called bomb peak, we have again a tracer of new versus old carbon in the soil, meaning in that case pre-bomb versus post-bomb carbon. As for C13, a large number of depth profiles have now been analyzed for C14 that are gathered in an international soil radiocarbon database, ISRAD. An important synthesis was published in 2020 by Ski and co-workers, symmetrical to that of Balazan et al. For C13 on 789 profiles covering all types of land cover in the climate zones. The results of this compilation are illustrated in this plot of delta C14 versus soil depths down to 5 meters in that case. We see again, as with C13, carbon age increasing with depth, meaning lower delta C14 as you go deeper in the soil, including negative numbers reflecting radioactive decay, say several thousand years age. This aging with depth is due to smaller inputs from the plants above, decreased microbial activity with depth, and increased stabilization of carbon by association with clay minerals. However, also noticeable in this plot is the clear influence of temperature with younger ages associated with higher temperature. That's yellow points on the right versus the blue or green one on the left. But we can distinguish also an effect of higher precipitation, same thing. Higher ages are related to higher precipitation. This is due to longer growing season with increased temperature and increased precipitation, enhanced net primary production, and increased transfer to depth with increasing infiltration. The next step, again, so new carbon versus old carbon in the picture. So the next step, again, is to go beyond this qualitative distinction between pre-bomb and post-bomb carbon to obtain ages, number about ages. In the case of C14, this goes through simple numerical modeling. Using the well-documented shape of the C14 input curve with time, the response of various carbon pools with different residence times can be simulated. The figure on the right illustrates the smoothing of the input function depending on the residence time, 10 years in brown versus 1,000 years in blue, the back. In other words, for a given measured value of delta C14, you can determine the carbon residence time required to fit that value. This was performed by Shi and co-workers who gridded the model ages that they obtained on global maps that you can see here delta C14 on the left, and the carbon ages deduced from them on the right. It immediately appears the much older ages in boreal ecosystems, and also the striking contrast between young carbon in shallow soil and old ages of carbon in deeper levels again. However, the main outcome was clearly here to obtain, to calculate weighted average values of these ages with these numbers ranging from 1,000 years close to the surface to 8,000 years at depth, and with a world average of 4,830 years. So very smart again, indeed. But if I didn't put you to sleep yet, you may realize that we may be facing a problem here. Indeed, if you confront the delta C13 figures that I showed before with the delta C14 ages of Schiettal, we see one order of magnitude difference between the two. And of course, this is no trivial debate. In one case, on the left, you conclude that it is worth a try to increase the carbon storage rate in the soil, as you may expect to see results within a man's lifetime span. In the other case, on the right, forget it. It's way too slow, and we would act just in prevision of the next glacial ages. I will not give you a solution to this discrepancy because we don't have it yet. This is an open discussion going on in the community, but we can discuss it later if you are interested. On the other hand, another serious problem was pointed out by Xi and co-workers when you compare the delta C14 data from actual measurements with the delta C13 values predicted by the global land numerical models. So data on the top and model results below. So you see, shown in the figures that the different well-established community models strongly overestimate delta C14 values both in surface and in subsurface soils. The authors attributed this disagreement to positive biases of the models for fresh carbon in flow fluxes at depth, and thus overestimated parameterized turnover rates in slow and passive carbon pools. They urged re-examination of the model's algorithm and parameters, and I do not see anything showing that this recommendation was acted upon yet. To continue, I prepared a series of snapshots on several recent studies carried out at the site level instead of global metadata compilations that I showed before. Each of these examples are aimed at specific important questions in relation to the 4 per mil initiative question. So time of carbon storage in the deep horizon, variation with land cover, how really can we detect carbon buildup from organic fertilizer? Can we really quantify the effect? But I will go to save time directly to the last two with the question related to the so-called priming effect and this question of analogs I mentioned at the beginning. So we will skip several examples. And the first one I would like to discuss and present pertains to this so-called priming effects. This is actually one of the main factors of uncertainty when we try to quantify the efficiency of carbon retention in response to organic fertilizer. The idea is that when you increase the carbon input on top of the soil, you do, of course, stimulate vegetation growth, and you add external carbon to the system, but you also stimulate microbial activity beneath, and thus you increase the rate of remineralization of the carbon stock. As a consequence, the increase in carbon inventory that you can measure with time is in fact the sum of three terms: the new carbon input from the vegetation and the fertilizer, the original stock of all carbon, but those are subtracted by the amount of carbon lost due to this priming effect. And clearly, measuring concentration alone does not allow to distinguish between these three terms. So the example I want to show you comes from a publication by Papandour and co-workers. He's actually from the UM6P, and the work was done with French colleagues. And the study is most original in several ways. First, by the scale of the samples they analyzed, because they measured the root-attached soil fraction. This means scratching the very small amount of soil closely attached to the roots within the soil, which is a fraction that directly contains the microbial byproducts, which are the main vector of carbon penetration and stabilization into the soil. Second, the time scale of the experiment is also remarkable, as they showed that meaningful origin signal can be detected within a month of experimental culture. Here, it's a growth of various genotypes of millet in a greenhouse controlled condition. So what did they show? First, at the top, no signal detectable with the carbon concentration, no significant difference between the root-attached soil in the white boxes and the bulk soil in black. So, root-attached soil and bulk soil samples apart from each other by only 15 centimeters within the pots. By contrast, delta C13 is already clearly higher in the root-attached soil because millet is a C4 plant with higher delta C13 than the forest soil, which was chosen for the experiment. And third, at the bottom, delta C14 is lower in the root-attached soil, at least for some of the species. This is because, and more complicated, because the input from millet comes with atmospheric carbon of the day it was assimilated by the plant. It reflects present-day atmosphere, whereas the bulk soil samples integrates the residence time of carbon in the soil. And the atmospheric C14 composition is nowadays really decreasing due to the fossil fuel C14 free carbon input, old carbon. So the bulk carbon soil reflects this old carbon, you calculate a few decades back on average, and thus this explains why the root-attached soil is lower. Finally, the most original contribution of this work is that first of its kind to my knowledge, they solved the system of three equations for the three unknown, so old carbon, new carbon, and the printing effect loss of carbon. And surprisingly enough, this is the only study that I know that did that at this stage. So what they showed is that at the early stage, within a month again of culture growth, they showed that the priming effect actually dominates the input of new carbon from the millet. And they also showed that different lines of millet with different phenotypes regarding the size of rhizohes, the root-attached soil dimension, had significantly different carbon storage efficiencies. And of course, this is a result of interest for agronomists in prospect of future breeding attempts and for-per-meal incentives. My next example related to this analog story comes from a recent thesis at Serege from Cécile Grappelou, who measured 36 chlorine in soil depth profile under forest on a site from northern France. So 36 chlorine as C14 is a carcinogenic isotope that was overwhelmed completely by several orders of magnitude by the nuclear test, leading again to a well-documented bomb peak also for that nuclide. It's slightly preceded, as you see, the C14 or tritium peaks because its production was mostly from irradiation of seawater chlorine during the earlier test in the Pacific. 36 chlorine is also in extremely low abundance in nature as other carcinogenic isotopes, but it can be measured anyway by accelerator mass spectrometry, in particular, and the 6 megavolt accelerator ASTER that we have at Serege. While most of the chlorine deposited on the soil by the rain is in ionic form and thus travels readily through the soil without being retained, a small fraction gets attached as organochloride compounds on soil particles. So what Cécile Grappelou showed is that when you access to these phases, these organochloride phases, thanks to a technique called hydropyrolysis, you obtain again a nice profile of accumulation of 36 chlorine this depth into the soil. Since again we know the input function with time exactly as for C14, one can calculate the characteristic residence time of those organochloride compounds, molecules, at each depth in the soil. The results that she obtained show very nice correlations both between the fraction of chlorine that is fixed, which is, as expected, very low. You see only a few percent, and very nice correlation with the organic carbon at each depth, but also a very nice correlation between the residence time of organochloride compounds with the delta C13 ages that I showed before from Jérôme Baledon. So this obviously makes a very promising contribution to the ongoing debate pointed out before between C14 and C13, although, of course, this study has to be reproduced and generalized. All right, in summary, I hope I convinced you that although K5 studies, isotopes are inescapable in getting precise understanding of the mechanisms of soil behavior within the soil. One of the godfathers of isotope geochemistry, Jerry Wasserburg, was saying that only isotopes don't lie. I tried to convince you that we already acquired very convincing, important results, but isotope and soil science can still considered as an emerging field, and there are still first-order questions which are still open. And the line for progress are clearly we need more coupling between delta C13 and delta C14 studies. Only very few have been carried out to date. Another point is that I think that people have been beginning by doing world compilations of global data, as I showed you, and but we need more school case depth profiles to understand and to show and to teach those results and techniques. And the final point is that nowadays with small accelerators that I showed you is now open the field of compound-specific analysis. We can look at molecules within the soil, and this opens a completely new field, although much discussion is opened about that. I would like to finish by thanking very much the colleagues that fed me my presentation with real data. They are the real specialists. Probably they should be invited more than me to give this talk. And thank you also to Daniel for forcing me to looking at this important question I never looked at before preparing this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for enhancing our understanding for the use of isotopes to study the dynamic of carbon, and also for the importance of new innovative tools to achieve environmental goals. We can take 2 questions. We have first one. Yeah, Leo. Leonardus. So I think we have to start thinking about introducing carbon sequestration potential in breeding. So since the figure shows how different the millet lines in terms of carbon sequestration. Yes, Leo.
Thank you very much, Professor Bruno, for again bringing this great technique, which is again the use of isotopes to track the elemental cycling, the biogeochemical cycling of the elements in the environment, carbon, but not only, the other ones as well. So a question is, as we were discussing before with the presentation of Professor Ratanlal, so carbon sequestration in the soils is an important component for us to make agriculture part of the solutions to climate change. So it's, as Professor Lal said, so it's the only industry that can be net negative if we can store this carbon there. And the figure, the numbers that you gave, they are very important because they show that actually it's not only to sequester carbon, but we actually have to bring this carbon down there, right? Because if we are bringing this carbon down to 1 meter, then it's sequestered for millennia, then it's going to stay down there. So then this goes back to the potential, especially of the tropical soils, because we know that again the temperate northern soils, they are usually shallower and again richer as well than the tropical ones. But in the tropics, we have these very deep soils that again, if we can correct, especially the poor soil fertility of the soils, we can store more carbon. So can you comment a little bit more on that? Again, the impact of this, of bringing carbon, especially through root system, down the soil profile, on again, making agriculture part of the solution to climate change. And again, thank you very much.
I'm not sure I can comment very much on this. You've seen that this study about looking specifically at the rhizosphere is very important. So this clearly has to be done both in high latitudes or moderate latitudes and tropical environments. My impression of discovering this field is that much has to be expected from looking at microbial processes and specific molecules to understand which of these products actually carry the carbon down to the soil, and then make comparison effectively between tropical and moderate latitudes biomes, and compare those data. But this is again an open field, and I'm not sure I can comment much more than this at this stage.
We can afford one more question. Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Professor, for your insightful presentation. So you talk about the priming effect. When we talk about carbon sequestration, we are more and more advocating the increase of organic inputs. So my question is, according to you, is the priming effect of soil organic matter sufficiently taken into account when we talk about the potential of agriculture in terms of carbon sequestration? Thanks.
Not sure. Could you repeat your question? Not sure I got the point. What kind of practical?
So my question is if the effect of the priming effect is sufficiently taken into account when we talk about the potential of agriculture to sequester carbon in soils.
So, for instance, if you I had an example that maybe we can discuss at the round table at noon. I had an example about vineyard cultivation sites and profiles. So the kind of techniques that we can apply to increase the carbon transfer to the soil and to deepen the soil are well known. It is leaving the residues after the crop harvesting, leaving the residues on the soil, and maybe grassing the vines instead of removing all the grass from it. And again, using organic fertilizers. So the measures, the techniques are well known. What is difficult is to be sure that we can measure the effects of those techniques with time and prove that they are efficient.
Thank you, Professor Bruno Hamla. You made a good link for our next speaker, who will discuss the safe recycling of organic waste in agriculture. Please welcome Dr. Emmanuel Dalch. His talk will be about fat and ecotoxicity of organic waste-borne trace elements during agricultural recycling. You have 30 minutes. 25 will be good. Thank you. Mike.
And giving me the opportunity to share some results we get recently with my colleagues and students. Since I'm the last speaker of this morning, I've decided to switch to French to maintain a sufficient flow to ensure being on time for lunch, which is becoming critical around noon. Donc, pour démarrer cette présentation, je voudrais juste souligner les deux logos qui sont sur cette première slide. Parce que je suis un chercheur du CIRAD et dans ce cadre-là, je conduis des projets de recherche en partenariat avec des collègues qui sont basés dans des institutions de recherche ou des universités des pays du Sud. Et parallèlement, j'ai la chance depuis plusieurs années d'être accueilli au CEREJ, qui nous offre, les étudiants que j'encadre et moi-même, un environnement humain, technique, particulièrement stimulant et performant pour conduire ces recherches. Alors aujourd'hui, je vous propose une présentation en 4 points. Je vais d'abord essayer de souligner les enjeux du recyclage agricole de matières organiques ou de déchets organiques. Je me focaliserai ensuite sur l'enjeu ou l'importance de se pencher sur une catégorie de contaminants bien spécifiques que sont les éléments traces ou métaux lourds, qui peuvent être apportés par ces matières organiques. Je détaillerai un peu les travaux qu'on a conduits pour essayer de comprendre le devenir, le comportement de ces éléments dans des sols cultivés. Et je terminerai plutôt par des perspectives sur l'impact, le potentiel impact toxique de ces éléments, toujours dans les sols cultivés. Alors, en guise d'introduction, je vais m'appuyer sur des travaux récents d'un collègue, Tom Wassenaar, qui a évalué les flux de nutriments et de déchets de grandes cités subsahariennes. Et je vais vous présenter les résultats pour l'une d'entre elles, Ouagadougou, au Burkina Faso. Alors, vous allez voir, la figure est assez complexe, donc je vais les simplifier très brièvement. Vous avez au centre, en bleu ciel, ce qui correspond à la ville de Ouagadougou. En mauve, la périphérie qui est plutôt rurale, et puis à l'extérieur, le Burkina Faso. Et donc, il a comptabilisé pour Ouagadougou l'ensemble des flux entrants d'azote et sortants. Donc voilà le résultat. On ne va évidemment pas le détailler, on va simplement se focaliser sur les flux qui sont quantitativement les plus importants, en partant à haut à gauche de cette figure. Vous avez en assuré l'ensemble des flux, c'est à peu près 11 000 tonnes d'azote qui sont liées à l'importation de l'alimentation dans Ouagadougou. Donc cette alimentation, elle est consommée, digérée et excrétée. Et donc vous avez une deuxième flèche vert foncé au centre de la diapositive qui correspond à l'ensemble des flux d'azote, d'excréments qui vont dans les toilettes. Si on poursuit vers la droite, vous voyez qu'il y a à peu près 3 000 tonnes de cet azote qui va terminer sous de forme de stockage plus ou moins contrôlée. Et donc, ce qui veut dire que par rapport aux 11 000 tonnes de départ, on a 8 000 tonnes qui sont perdues, en partie sous forme atmosphérique, sous forme de dégazement, et également via les eaux usées qui ne sont pas collectées, qui vont rejoindre les réseaux hydrographiques de surface ou les eaux profondes. Alors, si on caricature un petit peu plus ce schéma, on voit ce fonctionnement de la ville de Ouagadougou assez proche de cette représentation de l'économie linéaire, c'est-à-dire avec une zone, plutôt les zones rurales de production qui s'appauvrissent au cours du temps en azote, et puis une zone qui va plutôt être perçue comme un puits, la ville, qui accumule des déchets riches en azote. Et évidemment, vous savez que face à la raréfaction des ressources, il y a un réel enjeu à essayer de recycler cet azote notamment, mais les nutriments en général, pour limiter l'impact de nos pratiques. Et ça prend tout son sens, par exemple, si on fait l'analogie avec les déchets de l'alimentation, qui peuvent être relativement simplement collectés, compostés, et ce compost peut à son tour servir d'amendement pour les cycles culturaux successifs. Donc il y a un réel enjeu à mettre en place cette pratique. Pour essayer de vous donner des ordres de grandeur, je vais m'appuyer sur une étude qui vient de sortir, qui a été réalisée dans le cadre de l'initiative DESIRA. Et ces auteurs se sont appuyés sur 12 pays en Afrique. Ils ont évalué les stocks de déchets organiques présents, leur composition, et ils ont également évalué les besoins en nutriments des cultures qui sont réalisées dans ces pays. Et leur conclusion est assez parlante. Ils disent que si on mettait en place un recyclage efficace des déchets organiques qui sont produits dans ces pays, on pourrait couvrir à peu près les besoins en nutriments des systèmes agricoles actuels. Alors, je vous donne quelques chiffres. Ils estiment que les eaux usées, on l'a vu à Ouagadougou, qui sont assez peu collectées, en fait, pourraient apporter 75% du triptyque NPK qui est actuellement consommé par l'agriculture de ces pays. Et puis, les déchets alimentaires ou de déchets verts pourraient apporter 20 à 40% de ces nutriments. Mais une autre conclusion importante de cette étude, c'est qu'en fait, à l'heure actuelle, ces flux de matière organique ne sont sous-utilisés. Donc la ressource est là, mais elle est mal utilisée, ou pas utilisée du tout. Pour essayer de lister un peu les avantages de cette pratique, ça a été évoqué déjà ce matin, la pratique du recyclage agricole permet un recyclage des nutriments, mais elle permet également, ce qu'a rappelé Bruno Hamla tout à l'heure, de stocker du carbone dans les sols. Et elle contribue aussi à améliorer les propriétés des sols. Ce sont des propriétés physiques, chimiques, mais également biologiques, en stimulant par exemple la microflore. Mais comme toute pratique, elle a aussi des inconvénients, des désavantages. Et c'est lié notamment à la présence potentielle de contaminants dans ces déchets qui résultent de leur mode de production. On peut, si on simplifie, retrouver 3 grandes catégories de contaminants. Les contaminants organiques, par exemple les molécules pharmaceutiques qu'on absorbe et puis qu'on excrète et qui vont se terminer dans les eaux usées. On peut trouver des contaminants biologiques, des pathogènes par exemple, et également des contaminants inorganiques qu'on appelle éléments traces ou métaux lourds. Alors, ces éléments traces, dont je vais parler un peu plus au cours de cet exposé, vous en connaissez certainement quelques-uns, le mercure, l'arsenic, le cuivre, etc. Il faut savoir qu'il y en a un grand nombre, ils sont 70 à peu près, présents dans la croûte terrestre, et ils sont donc présents naturellement dans les sols. C'est des éléments qui ont les propriétés de ne pas se dégrader, et pour certains d'entre eux, par exemple le cas du chrome ou du cuivre, ils peuvent être à la fois un oligoélément, c'est-à-dire indispensable à certains processus biologiques, mais ils peuvent également devenir, sur certaines conditions, parce que leur forme chimique change, ou parce qu'ils sont présents en trop grande concentration, devenir toxiques. Et donc je vais faire un tout petit focus sur cette notion d'écotoxicité, c'est-à-dire la toxicité vis-à-vis des organismes du sol. Elle va dépendre de 2 facteurs clés importants, la nature de l'élément et sa forme chimique qu'on appelle aussi spéciation. Alors pour l'illustrer, je prends 2 études, 2 exemples. Le premier concerne la toxicité des métaux vis-à-vis des plantes. Et pour mesurer ça, un des indicateurs qu'on peut regarder, on expose une même plante à différentes concentrations, différents métaux, et on regarde son élongation racinaire. Donc là, l'indicateur qui est retenu par ces auteurs, c'est définir le seuil, la concentration à partir de laquelle on observe une réduction des racines de 50%. Vous voyez que pour le zinc, il faut atteindre une concentration de 1 mg de zinc dans la solution du sol pour voir cette réduction, alors que pour le cuivre, il faut apporter 1000 fois moins de cuivre, puisqu'on est à 1 microgramme par litre. Donc vous voyez que les 2 éléments sont toxiques, mais avec un niveau et une ampleur radicalement différents. Il y a 3 ordres de grandeur d'écart. Sur le point de le deuxième important facteur qui est l'espèce chimique, je m'appuie sur une autre étude qui a regardé l'impact de zinc, d'exposition de zinc sur des populations de vers de terre. Et donc, ils ont exposé ces vers de terre à 2 formes de zinc, la forme soluble qu'on trouve dans une solution, Zn2+, et puis des petites particules d'oxyde de zinc. Et vous voyez que c'est la forme soluble, Zn2+, qui est la plus toxique. Il suffit d'en apporter 600 mg pour voir un effet significatif sur la population des vers de terre. Alors, pourquoi je vous parle de tout ça, et en particulier, pourquoi je vous parle de ça en lien avec les déchets organiques? Alors, pour l'illustrer, je m'appuie sur une étude qui n'est pas mondiale, qui est française, qui a été réalisée au début des années 2010, et les auteurs ont fait la compilation des apports d'éléments traces sur les sols agricoles français, chaque année. Et chaque année, ce sont 23 000 tonnes de métaux qui sont répandus sur les sols agricoles. Et vous voyez qu'il y a 2 éléments qui ressortent très nettement du point de vue quantitatif, ce sont le zinc et le cuivre. Ce qui est intéressant dans cette étude, c'est qu'ils identifient bien entendu l'origine de ces métaux. Pour le zinc, elle est majoritairement liée aux épandages d'effluents d'élevage, des effluents d'animaux. Et pour le cuivre, il y a une contribution à part égale entre ces effluents d'élevage et des traitements fongicides bien connus sous le nom de bouillie bordelaise. Alors, la contribution des métaux dans les effluents d'élevage, elle est relativement bien connue et ça s'explique par les suppléments qui sont apportés aux aliments du bétail. En effet, il a été montré depuis longtemps par les vétérinaires notamment que des aliments supplémentés en zinc et en cuivre permettaient une croissance meilleure des animaux, les protéger de certaines maladies, certains parasites. Et c'est ce qu'on voit bien sur cette figure. Ce sont des poulets qui ont le même âge, mais qui ont été nourris avec des doses croissantes de la gauche vers la droite en zinc. Donc, c'est assez visuel. Ce qu'on sait aussi bien par rapport à ces quantités qui sont ingérées, c'est qu'en fait, elles sont très peu métabolisées par les animaux et qu'en fait, la quasi-totalité de ces métaux sont excrétés et vont donc finir dans les fumiers ou les lisiers. pouvez retenir que c'est à peu près 80-95%, ça dépend des éléments, qui sont retrouvés finalement dans les effluents d'élevage. Alors si on se replace dans le contexte de l'épandage de ces matières organiques, elles peuvent être épandues brutes sous forme de fumier, de lisier, mais elles peuvent aussi subir des pré-traitements, par exemple la méthanisation ou le compostage, qui sont deux techniques différentes. Mais comme je vous l'ai dit, ces métaux, en fait, ils ne se dégradent pas, et au cours de ces traitements, on n'élimine pas les métaux. Et donc, in fine, quelle que soit la forme sous laquelle on apporte ces effluents, on épand en fait de grandes quantités de métaux. Et donc évidemment, ce qui nous a intéressés, c'était de regarder dans des contextes du Sud quel était le devenir de ces éléments de trace après les rapports sur les sols. Je reviens juste un peu sur un ordre de grandeur. On a récemment essayé d'estimer à l'échelle mondiale ce que ça pouvait représenter l'impact de l'épandage des effluents d'élevage en croisant différentes informations sur la production de bétail, sur la composition des aliments, pardon. Et on a estimé que c'était à peu près 500 000 tonnes de zinc qui étaient potentiellement épandues à la surface des sols cultivés. Et donc évidemment, la question qu'on se pose, parce que c'est des éléments potentiellement toxiques, c'est est-ce que ces éléments vont être prélevés par les plantes, ou alors est-ce que et où vont-ils s'accumuler dans les sols ou, au contraire, contaminer la nappe souterraine? Pour étudier ces aspects, on s'est basé sur différentes approches. On a étudié des expériences agronomiques de longue durée dans différentes régions du monde. On a essayé de caractériser très finement les espèces chimiques qu'on pouvait observer dans les sols, et on a essayé également de compléter avec des expériences de laboratoire. Juste un petit mot sur ces expériences agronomiques. Donc, elles sont conduites souvent par des universités ou des institutions de recherche, plutôt dans l'idée de comparer des modalités de fertilisation un peu différentes. C'est l'exemple que vous avez sur cette figure. C'est un essai que l'unité dans laquelle je suis au CIRAD conduit à La Réunion. Ça ne se voit pas bien, mais c'est de la canne à sucre. Et donc, on a 5 répétitions, 5 blocs, où on compare, vous voyez, c'est les petits patchs de couleurs, des matières organiques différentes. Et donc, en fait, grâce à nos partenariats, on a eu la chance d'accéder à un grand nombre d'essais de ce type-là dans des contextes pédoclimatiques très contrastés. Je cite le Brésil, le Sénégal, la Réunion, mais aussi le Danemark. Et donc, ça nous a permis de faire des mesures sur des sols avec des propriétés très contrastées aussi, des sols acides, alcalins, sableux, argileux, qui avaient des historiques d'épandage de matières organiques différentes. Et tous ces essais sont d'abord de longue durée et sont aussi managés de manière très rigoureuse, c'est-à-dire qu'on a un historique très précis de l'ensemble des pratiques. Et on peut donc faire des bilans assez fins des quantités épandues et de leur devenir. Alors, un exemple de résultat qui est lié à une collaboration qu'on a développée avec l'Université fédérale de Santa Maria, qui est un État qui se trouve dans un État du sud du Brésil où se concentre l'élevage du bétail. Donc, ces collègues nous ont envoyé, ils mènent un essai agronomique depuis 2004, et nous ont envoyé des échantillons de sol qu'ils ont prélevés depuis la surface. Vous avez la profondeur sur l'axe vertical, jusqu'à 25 cm. En fait, j'ai des données plus profondes, mais le profil, vous verrez, ne bouge plus après 25 cm. Et vous voyez que pour le sol contrôle, qui ne reçoit aucun épandage, on a une concentration homogène, relativement faible, qui ne bouge pas. Si on fait les mêmes déterminations pour le sol amendé, vous voyez une augmentation très forte d'un facteur 15 à la surface des sols de la concentration en cuivre, qui s'explique par l'apport répété des effluents d'élevage. Alors cet exemple-là, on l'a obtenu au Brésil, mais en fait, ce profil, on l'a observé dans toutes les conditions qu'on a étudiées. On observe majoritairement une accumulation dans les sols, un prélèvement par les cultures très faible et également un lessivage faible, quel que soit le type de déchets organiques, quel que soit le type de sol. Alors on était assez surpris de ce résultat-là. On a conduit des expériences en laboratoire pour contrôler un peu plus finement les apports, mais on a fait confirmer ces observations de terrain. Donc voilà un exemple de colonnes de sol dans lesquelles on mesure beaucoup plus finement entrée et sortie, et vous voyez que le résultat, c'est une accumulation majoritaire. Donc le bilan, certes, c'est qu'on a une accumulation, mais pour autant, on n'est pas capable d'expliquer ce qu'il y a derrière cette accumulation. Et donc notre idée, ça a été de remonter ce schéma et de repartir des suppléments ou des additifs pour essayer de comprendre l'évolution des formes chimiques du cuivre et du zinc. Et on a eu la chance de participer à un programme avec des partenaires qui ont pu mettre en place de grosses expérimentations avec des animaux, vous voyez des volailles et des porcs, qui ont été nourris avec des additifs de différentes formes, j'en ai représenté quelques-uns, des oxydes de zinc, des sulfates, et donc on a bénéficié d'une collection d'échantillons remarquables qu'on a amenés sur de grands outils qui nous permettent de caractériser la spéciation. Et c'est ce que je voudrais vous montrer sur la prochaine figure. Donc ces outils, qu'on appelle le synchrotron, permettent, d'identifier les formes chimiques qui sont présentes dans un échantillon, mais elles permettent aussi de quantifier les proportions de ces différentes espèces. Donc, la première chose qu'on a fait, c'était de vérifier que ce que nous donnait le fournisseur d'additifs correspondait bien à ce qu'il nous proposait. Donc on a travaillé sur l'oxyde de zinc, et donc on a vérifié, c'est l'histogramme, que 100% du zinc qui était présent dans cet additif était bien de l'oxyde de zinc. Ces additifs, ensuite, ils sont mélangés avec la ration alimentaire qui est composée de maïs et de soja essentiellement. Et donc là, on a regardé la spéciation dans l'aliment. Et là, première surprise, en fait, l'oxyde du zinc a quasiment disparu, on n'en observe plus que 10%, et 90% du zinc est sous une nouvelle forme de phytate de zinc. Alors le phytate, c'est la forme organique du phosphore qui est naturellement présente dans les graines. On a ensuite regardé l'évolution de la spéciation à travers le système digestif des animaux. On a regardé par exemple dans le contenu stomacal et on a observé que du zinc sous la forme phytate. Et ce zinc phytate, on le retrouve dans l'intestin, puis dans l'iléum. Et c'est qu'une fois arrivé au côlon qu'on voit apparaître une nouvelle forme chimique de sulfure de zinc, qu'on explique par potentiellement la présence de bactéries sulfatoréductrices dans cette partie du système digestif des animaux. Puis ensuite, quand on analyse les fesses fraîches ou stockées pour simuler un stockage dans une fosse à lisier, on n'observe plus que des sulfures de zinc. Alors ça, c'était assez intéressant pour nous parce que ces sulfures de zinc, ce n'est pas des formes chimiques qu'on retrouve naturellement dans les sols. Donc on s'est dit qu'on avait là un intéressant proxy pour aller regarder l'impact et la localisation de ces métaux issus de l'épandage de lisier de porc, par exemple. Et donc je vais vous illustrer ça avec un autre essai, une autre collaboration qu'on a réalisée avec des collègues, cette fois-ci d'un autre État du Brésil, Santa Catarina, qui ont mis à notre disposition une série d'échantillons de sol amendés pendant plus de 10 ans avec des lisiers de porc, avec une conséquence, comme je vous l'ai dit tout à l'heure, qui est qu'on a dans ces sols amendés une très forte augmentation de la teneur en zinc. Vous voyez, le sol contrôle, on est à 100, on passe à près de 200 pour le sol amendé. Et ce qui nous a intéressé là, c'était de regarder sous quelle forme chimique était le zinc dans le sol. Alors, dans le sol contrôle, on trouve deux formes, des zincs liés à des oxydes de fer et du zinc lié à des argiles, la kaolinite. Ce qui était finalement assez logique, c'est des sols qui sont riches, naturellement riches en oxyde de fer et en argile. Donc sur ces sols, je vous rappelle, on a apporté pendant 11 ans des sulfures de zinc qui ont eu pour conséquence de doubler la concentration totale du zinc dans le sol amendé. Et donc, on s'attendait à avoir 7 types de spéciation, c'est-à-dire la moitié du zinc sous la forme de sulfure de zinc et le reste correspondant à notre sol contrôle. Et en fait, ce n'est pas du tout ce qu'on a observé. Les sulfures de zinc ont complètement disparu de la spéciation du zinc dans le sol amendé. On voit un nouveau composant du zinc lié à de la matière organique, mais on voit aussi que la proportion de zinc sorbé sur l'argile et l'oxyde de fer a augmenté. Alors ça nous a un peu ennuyé parce que ça mettait un peu à plat notre perspective de pouvoir suivre les sulfures de zinc et d'affiner notre compréhension des mécanismes. Donc on est retourné au laboratoire et on a travaillé sur la caractérisation de ces sulfures de zinc. Je vous passe les étapes, mais ce qu'on a découvert, c'était qu'en fait, dans les effluents liquides, type digestat de méthanisation, effluents d'élevage, boue de station d'épuration, en fait, les sulfures de zinc sont sous forme très petite. Ce sont en fait des nanoparticules de sulfure de zinc dont on a déterminé une taille moyenne à peu près de 5 nanomètres. Donc elles sont très petites, mais en plus, on a montré que ces nanoparticules, elles étaient très instables dès qu'on les apportait à l'air libre, à la surface du sol. Et en fait, elles se dissolvent très rapidement, en quelques heures, ce qui est illustré avec l'apparition des octaèdres de zinc à la surface de ce sol. Et donc, comme ce zinc est libéré très rapidement, il peut ensuite facilement interagir avec les composantes du sol, que ce soit la matière organique, les oxydes de fer ou les minéraux argileux. Donc pour conclure, vous voyez qu'on a réussi au cours du temps à avoir une vision un peu plus claire de l'impact de cette pratique. On a observé, je ne parlais que du zinc, mais on a des résultats tout à fait similaires pour le cuivre, qu'en termes de comportement, en fait, ces éléments s'accumulent majoritairement à la surface du sol. On a une perception un peu meilleure des mécanismes réactionnels qui expliquent cette accumulation. Et évidemment, comme ces métaux sont potentiellement toxiques, c'est la dernière partie de mon exposé, on s'interroge sur l'impact toxicologique de ces métaux vis-à-vis des organismes du sol. Alors, cette approche, elle est complexe, elle n'est pas triviale, et donc on a eu deux approches différentes. La première, ça a été d'utiliser, là aussi encore, des essais agronomiques de longue durée, de comparaison de modalités de fertilisation, et en particulier un essai maraîchage qu'on conduit à La Réunion depuis plusieurs années. Parce que cet essai, on a un monitoring très fin des teneurs en métaux dans les sols, dans les plantes, l'évolution des caractéristiques du sol, c'est l'évolution du pH, de la matière organique. Et cette détermination, en fait, elles nous ont permis de caler des modèles. Un premier modèle d'évolution du comportement des métaux dans les sols, et puis ils nous ont permis de faire une évaluation de seuil toxicologique. Je vais vous présenter les résultats juste après. À gauche, donc, vous avez les résultats, ce sont les points verts, de l'évolution de la concentration en cuivre dans une des parcelles amendées avec un compost. Et vous voyez que globalement, on a une augmentation avec une hétérogénéité forte, c'est du terrain, mais on a une augmentation régulière des teneurs en cuivre au cours du temps. On a réussi à caler un modèle, c'est les courbes noires foncées que vous voyez, et on s'est en fait servi de ce modèle pour extrapoler l'accumulation du cuivre à la surface du sol pendant 100 ans. Et on a comparé cette extrapolation avec les seuils de toxicité qui sont prévus pour ce type de sol en intégrant le pH du sol, sa teneur en matière organique. Et donc, c'est ce que vous avez représenté sur ce graphique. Vous avez, sur l'axe des ordonnées, les concentrations en cuivre dans le sol en fonction des 100 années où on a fait l'étude. Et ce qui est intéressant de regarder, c'est le croisement entre l'accumulation du cuivre, qui est la courbe en noir, avec le seuil toxicologique en rouge. Et vous voyez que d'après cette prédiction, on serait susceptible de voir un impact du cuivre qui s'accumule sur les organismes du sol autour de 28 ans. Autrement dit, cette accumulation, en fait, elle a un impact toxicologique potentiel en quelques dizaines d'années. Alors évidemment, cette approche-là, c'est une approche par modélisation. Il nous reste à la vérifier en retournant sur le terrain avec des gens compétents sur ces questions-là. Et je voudrais juste terminer par signaler deux perspectives qui nous semblent importantes et qu'on commence à adresser actuellement. C'est qu'en fait, vous l'avez compris, en fait, les organismes du sol, quand on met en place cette pratique, ils ne sont pas exposés à un seul contaminant. Je vous ai présenté des données pour le cuivre. Mais en fait, ils sont exposés à du cuivre, du cadmium, du plomb, du mercure, etc. Et en fait, aujourd'hui, on est très démunis, les écotoxicologues sont très démunis pour se prononcer sur l'impact des cocktails de contaminants vis-à-vis des organismes du sol. Et on a démarré un programme de recherche avec des collègues pour essayer de quantifier ces aspects de mélange de contaminants. Par exemple, on ne sait pas si la toxicité du cuivre et du zinc s'additionne, ou si au contraire il y a une synergie, donc elles se multiplient, ou au contraire s'il y a un antagonisme entre ces deux contaminants. Alors on ne le sait pas pour les métaux, Mais on le sait encore moins quand on commence à combiner un élément trace et puis des contaminants organiques, comme par exemple des antibiotiques, des anti-inflammatoires. Et donc, ce sont ces questions-là qu'on commence à regarder. Et puis une dernière également, c'est, je vous ai dit, il y a 3 grandes catégories de contaminants. Il y a notamment des contaminants biologiques potentiellement toxiques. Ce sont, par exemple, les pathogènes humains qui, lorsqu'ils sont exposés à des antibiotiques et ou à des métaux, peuvent développer des mécanismes de résistance aux antibiotiques. Et donc, une question cruciale, c'est évidemment de s'assurer que si on épandait des potentiels pathogènes résistants aux antibiotiques, est-ce que ça pourrait contaminer la chaîne alimentaire et donc par voie de conséquence les êtres humains à même de consommer les végétaux potentiellement contaminés. Et donc ce sont des études qu'on a démarrées notamment à La Réunion, qui restent exploratoires, mais qu'on va essayer de poursuivre pour s'assurer que cette pratique-là n'induit pas ou n'engendre pas de risques sanitaires trop importants. Voilà, je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Merci, Dr Dolch. Merci pour votre présentation. Ça montre qu'une approche systémique est toujours la meilleure pour minimiser les risques futurs dus à l'innovation. On a des questions, oui, professeur. On a 2 questions ici.
Thank you very much. So it looks like that the problem is caused by repeating the application of the residue over and over at the same region, yeah? And what is the solution that France has deployed to avoid that farmers or the livestock growers, they would repeating the application? So ideally, we should transform it into a fertilizer and then spread it everywhere in a way that the accumulation would not happen. So what would be the solution for transforming it in a fertilizer? First question. And then, have you ever noticed whether the food produced under this system, it is fortified with zinc and copper? Because usually we take this as pills together with vitamins in the pharmacy. So ideally, we would consume fortified food. Is it also a strategy for food fortification?
Thank you, Edson, for these questions. So first of all, about the French legislation, so there is a legislation about sewage sludge spreading only in France or in Europe. There is no legislation, about spreading animal manure, for instance, except that you have to limit the dose of nitrogen you will apply by doing this spreading. So this is not considered up to date, so this part of the project, only for sewage sludge. And you're right, the option, this is a new paradigm, in fact, to fertilize or to use the content of zinc, for instance, or even iron or copper of this organic waste to fight what we call the hunger, hidden hunger, la faim cachée. So that could be an option to improve the quality of the crops by increasing their content in zinc, copper, or even iron. Some of my colleagues did some tests in Senegal to improve the crops, but I don't know the results yet. So I think we have to wait a little bit more.
Second question from Selma.
Bonjour. Permettez-moi de vous dire que c'était une présentation assez importante. Donc, permettez-moi juste de vous demander, s'il vous plaît, comme vous savez, il y a plusieurs technologies qui sont appliquées dans le sens de biofortification, notamment la nanotechnologie. Donc, il y a plusieurs approvisionnements de plusieurs types d'éléments qui peuvent être des macroéléments, bien évidemment, d'autres minéraux. En termes de biofortification, plusieurs scientifiques, donc en termes de publications scientifiques, donc elle essaye d'éviter ce type d'éco-toxicologie. Autrement dit, en termes de fer, cuivre, voire même zinc, donc lorsqu'il essaye de bien évidemment biofortifier des cultures, il essaye tout simplement de l'apprisionner d'une manière ou d'une autre, d'une manière contrôlée ou non contrôlée, en termes de nanotechnologie. Ils zappent bien évidemment cette partie-là. Donc, je ne sais pas, est-ce que vous pouvez élaborer, bien évidemment, est-ce qu'il y en a des standards ou bien des références sur lesquelles on peut reposer pour pouvoir bien évidemment confirmer bien évidemment une approche qui peut être concrètement applicable et administrée d'une manière correcte. Merci beaucoup.
Je ne suis pas sûr d'avoir bien compris votre question. Je vais faire une réponse en deux temps. Sur l'aspect biofortification, je ne sais pas si vous pensez à l'apport, par exemple, de traitement à la surface foliaire, par exemple, la surface des feuilles sous forme de nanoparticules. La toute petite expérience que j'ai sur ce type d'approche, c'est qu'en fait, ça ne marche pas trop, parce que ces nanoparticules, en fait, ne sont pas des formes très disponibles. Et donc, si j'en reviens à l'autre partie de la réponse, qui est est-ce qu'on peut améliorer la biofortification avec ces approches-là? C'est ce que je disais à Hudson juste avant, c'est qu'il y a des travaux qui essayent d'étudier ça, notamment au Sénégal. C'est des travaux qui démarrent. Et pour l'instant, on n'a pas suffisamment de recul pour proposer une solution clé en main, facilement utilisable, parce que les sols sont complexes, parce que l'interaction entre les cultures, les sols, les micro-organismes sont complexes et qu'on ne maîtrise pas encore bien tout ça. Et donc, pour l'instant, je vais dire qu'on tâtonne encore. Mais ça progresse régulièrement. Mais on n'est pas capable au jour d'aujourd'hui de proposer des solutions facilement applicables et duplicables dans de nombreuses situations.
Merci. Professor Jesli.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dolish, for sharing this very interesting data about the accumulation of zinc and copper in soil. So my question is related to the last part of your talk about using the model to predict what will happen in the next 100 years, right? So my comment is this prediction assumes that the pedoclimatic condition will remain the same, and also the culture, which will be the same, meaning if you are using cereals, it's not the same as we could convert to trees, for example. Mm. Is that something it's...
I completely agree with you that serious limit of this approach of using models. It's always better to have real data to be sure that we can conclude. So this is just, we use it as just an assessment, an evaluation of the potential negative impact of this practice of agricultural recycling. No more, no less. We didn't conclude that we are sure that after 28 years, we are sure that we will observe some impact. I even think that we will see nothing because there are so many confounding effects, because when you apply this organic waste, you increase the organic content of the soil, so you increase the pH of the soil. So in fact, the health of the soils in global view is even better if you compare with the more classic fertilizing conditions. This is just a range, a few decades. We need to verify, to check this assessment to be sure that it's correct or not. We don't know yet.
Yes, the next question is from Professor Ali Boularbah. The fourth question.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for this nice presentation. Ma question est relative un petit peu à la... vous avez, donc si j'ai bien compris, vous avez montré qu'il y a peu de... Le zinc, le cuivre s'accumule dans le sol, mais peu de transfert dans la plante. Donc a priori, c'est une bonne chose, puisqu'on limite un peu le risque de transfert dans la chaîne alimentaire. Est-ce que c'est la même chose que vous obtenez un petit peu en étudiant différents types de sols? D'accord. La deuxième question, c'est que, comme il s'agit bien sûr des... Il peut y avoir aussi d'autres polluants, bien sûr, pas uniquement inorganiques, mais il peut y avoir aussi organiques. Est-ce que vous avez aussi un petit peu analysé ça ou non? Parce que les sulfures de zinc, bien sûr, a priori, le zinc il est moins biodisponible, mais en fonction des conditions, il peut y avoir, notamment dans les sols acides, donc il pourrait plus solubiliser un petit peu ce zinc, mais aussi l'intervention des micro-organismes qui pourraient aussi oxyder les sulfures et carrément produire de l'acide sulfurique et par conséquent solubiliser aussi le zinc. Voilà, merci.
Merci Ali pour cette question. Alors sur le premier volet, oui, on a observé tout le temps ce comportement, un prélèvement faible par les cultures, une accumulation majoritaire, que le sol soit sableux, acide, alcalin. Je ne suis pas rentré dans les détails, mais je parlais que des sulfures, mais il y a évidemment d'autres formes. Par exemple, dans les composts, on ne voit plus du tout de sulfure, c'est d'autres formes qu'on observe. Et là aussi, on comprend bien pourquoi ça s'accumule dans les sols, donc ça devient un peu plus précis. Sur la partie des contaminants organiques, donc on fait ça en collaboration avec des collègues de Paris, puisqu'on participe à la photo de l'essai de canne à sucre que je vous ai montré. En fait, ça fait partie d'un réseau d'expérimentation agronomique. Donc, nous, dans notre unité, on en gère un au Sénégal et un à La Réunion. Puis on a des collègues qui en gèrent en Île-de-France, dans l'est de la France, en Bretagne. Et donc, on partage avec eux leur savoir-faire et notamment on bénéficie de leur expertise sur la quantification de ces contaminants organiques. Ils détectent des contaminants organiques, des antibiotiques, des anti-inflammatoires, toutes sortes de types de molécules organiques dans les effluents d'élevage, à des concentrations très variables. Il y a plusieurs ordres de grandeur en termes de concentration selon les molécules concernées. Et ils ont aussi évalué l'évolution de ces contaminants après apport sur le sol. Et en fait, ce sont des contaminants qui se dégradent, je veux dire relativement vite, si on compare aux métaux qui ne se dégradent pas du tout. Alors c'est très variable, ça dépend évidemment des contextes pédoclimatiques. Ils ont montré qu'à La Réunion, les contaminants organiques se dégradaient plus vite, l'effet de la température notamment. Donc voilà, on a des informations, on comprend mieux ce qui se passe. Les questions qu'on a à l'heure actuelle et sur lesquelles il y a une thèse qui démarre dans mon groupe, c'est de regarder le risque de transfert de ces contaminants organiques vers les cultures, notamment vers la canne à sucre. Pour l'instant, on a très peu de recul sur ça. Alors quand même souligner que c'est des analyses qui sont très fines et très complexes et que potentiellement, on voit qu'une partie des contaminants organiques. Parce qu'en fait, il faut les extraire et que cette extraction est assez complexe parce que, encore une fois, les sols sont un milieu complexe, multiphasique et que les méthodes sont difficilement applicables d'un sol à un autre et que ça génère des questions analytiques bien plus importantes finalement que l'analyse des métaux qui est assez simple par comparaison. Voilà.
On a une dernière question directe, s'il vous plaît, professeur.
Merci. Merci, professeur, pour cette excellente présentation qui touche effectivement un point très important, à savoir la contamination des sols, en particulier par les métaux lourds et qui, bien sûr, présentent un vrai danger, surtout lorsque je regarde votre présentation. Au début, effectivement, vous avez présenté un espoir, c'est qu'on peut nourrir le sol en utilisant, par exemple, des déchets tels que les fumiers, etc. etc. Mais il y a d'autres types de déchets qui risquent de poser beaucoup plus de problèmes. Par exemple, les déchets ménagers, si on les observe, il y a pas mal de traitements qui se font actuellement. Il y a, entre autres, l'incinération. Alors, cette incinération va nous donner un résidu qui est des cendres. Et si on analyse ces cendres, on obtient beaucoup d'éléments qui peuvent présenter un danger pour le sol. Et ma question est, vous avez présenté tout ce que vous avez fait concernant le cuivre et le zinc. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas d'autres travaux concernant d'autres éléments tels que le plomb, par exemple, ou autres, etc., etc. Il y a aussi les déchets hospitaliers aussi qui posent énormément de problèmes, où il y a beaucoup d'antibiotiques, beaucoup de métaux lourds aussi qui posent problème. Et malheureusement, jusqu'à présent, il n'y a pas vraiment des techniques de stockage efficaces qui vont nous permettre d'empêcher l'effet néfaste de ces éléments sur le sol. Et merci encore une fois pour cette excellente présentation. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, merci. Alors oui, j'ai centré la présentation sur le cuivre et le zinc, mais on a beaucoup travaillé parce qu'une partie de l'unité ciradienne à laquelle j'appartiens est basée à La Réunion, qui est une île volcanique qui est de fait naturellement très riche en chrome et en nickel, et que ça pose un problème réglementaire, alors qu'on parlait tout à l'heure de la réglementation des bouts de stations d'épuration, qui est calquée sur ce qu'a proposé l'Europe, et qui fixe des valeurs seuil, notamment en nickel et chrome, relativement basses par rapport à la taleur naturelle des sols réunionnais. Et donc, on travaille depuis plusieurs années en coopération avec les services de l'État pour obtenir une dérogation à cette réglementation européenne qui est limitante dans ce contexte géologique bien spécifique. Donc, on a notamment montré, avec nombreuses études de terrain, de laboratoire, spectroscopiques au synchrotron, que le chrome, présent en très grande quantité dans les sols de La Réunion, en fait, était très peu phytodisponible et que le ppm de chrome qu'on trouvait dans les végétaux cultivés à La Réunion, en fait, était sous sa forme la moins toxique. Alors, on sait que le chrome, la toxicité sur surtout le chrome 6, 6+, et en fait, dans les végétaux, on ne trouve que du chrome 3. Donc oui, on a travaillé sur d'autres éléments, un projet qui démarre sur le cadmium. Donc oui, on est évidemment intéressé par autre chose que le cuivre et le zinc, mais il fallait bien faire un choix.
Merci, professeur. Merci, chère audience. So we will be back here at 2:30 sharp. We will squeeze a little bit the agenda because we have Professor Katia Laval with us, and we don't want to miss her talk about forests and water management. So please join us here at 2:30 sharp after lunch. Thank you. Oh,